Good evening. Tonight we will drift into the shaded corridors of the medieval world, where the warmth of firelight and the echo of feasting often hid a darker undertone. Let us wander slowly into that age, step by step, as though time itself were a lantern carried through long, echoing halls. The great hall stood at the heart of most noble dwellings, a place both public and private, both sanctuary and stage. Its high rafters stretched upward like the ribs of a colossal beast, blackened with the soot of many winters, each timber breathing out the faint scent of resin and old smoke. Stone walls, sometimes rough and sometimes adorned with tapestries, enclosed a space alive with flickering light. Fire from the central hearth painted every surface with restless amber, making shadows leap and withdraw like silent courtiers. There was no silence in such a hall, even when empty. The wind pressed against narrow windows, rattling the shutters with a patient rhythm, while the draft under the doors hummed in a low, ceaseless tone. The scent of the room was its own history, layers of roasted meats, spilled ale, and the lingering sweetness of herbs used to disguise the sourness of wine clung to every surface. Beneath those aromas lay something older and deeper. The damp stone itself, the faint musk of rushes strewn across the floor, and the salt of sweat carried in by those who lived and labored around the noble household. When feasts were not underway, the hall still bore their memory, as though each gathering left behind an invisible tapestry of voices, laughter, whispers, and sighs. Outside, the world gave the hall its frame. In summer, the air was warm and carried scents from the kitchen gardens, garlic and parsley, mint and fennel stirred by breezes. In winter, the chill pressed against walls, reminding all within of the thinness of the barrier between survival and the raw season. Lanterns smoked faintly in the cold, their flames wavering blue at the edges, while torches along the passages sputtered with resin and pitch, leaving streaks of soot across plaster and stone. Those who entered the hall were immediately enveloped in layers of sensation. Cloaks wet from rain released their dampness as they dried near the hearth. Boots carried mud and straw, leaving traces across the reeds laid for the occasion. Jewelry, when worn, gleamed faintly in firelight, but much more often it was the gleam of metal, daggers, brooches, belt buckles, that caught the eye. The rustle of wool and linen accompanied the soft clink of pewter goblets, a music that never ceased when the hall was alive with feasting. At the tables themselves, which were trestles raised and dismantled according to need, lay the fabric of celebration. Heavy boards groaned under trenchers of bread, rough-hewn yet still warm when fresh. Platters bore meats dark and glistening, roasted venison, boar brought down in forest hunts, capons with crisp skin, and fishes gleaming with scales that caught the torchlight like shards of glass. Spices, rare and precious, were scattered sparingly, the mark of wealth visible in a single sprinkling of cinnamon or a trace of saffron dissolving into butter. The very act of displaying such flavors carried political weight, for only those with wide connections could command such treasures from distant lands. Yet beyond the surface of splendor, a subtle unease could often be felt. Every feast was not merely celebration, but theater, a staging ground where alliances were shown, where enmities were masked, and where dangers, silent, unseen, but palpable, might lurk among the cups and dishes. To the wandering eye, the hall shimmered with life. To the wary heart, it trembled with the possibility of treachery. In the colder corners of the room, shadows gathered thick. Servants moved there, silent and nearly invisible, carrying jugs of ale and wine, or bearing away dishes picked clean. Their presence, though often ignored, formed the machinery of the gathering. Hands that poured, feet that carried, eyes that observed from the periphery. These were the quiet witnesses to all that unfolded. Among them, some listened carefully, catching words not meant for them. Others averted their gaze, choosing silence as their own safety. Above, banners and coats of arms stretched down from rafters, swaying gently in drafts. They were reminders of lineage, of battles fought and blood claimed as noble, but they also declared rivalry. Each sigil was a declaration. This family, this house, this power stands here. Beneath such emblems, lords and ladies sat shoulder to shoulder, their laughter filling the air, though the set of their mouths when unobserved often told another story. A feast was as much a contest of masks as of dishes. Evening deepened slowly, as if reluctant. The sky beyond narrow windows moved from gray to indigo, and then to the blackness of night. Torches burned lower, releasing thicker smoke, while the central fire collapsed inward, with snapping softly under its own weight. The rhythm of the feast mirrored this decline. Loud at first, swelling with cheer, then quieter as bellies grew full and minds turned inward, softened by wine. It was often at this threshold, between vigor and drowsiness, that the darker currents of a feast revealed themselves. For with darkness came opportunity. The crowded hall blurred distinctions. A hand brushed another too closely. A purse at the belt grew lighter. A dagger slipped silently from its sheath. Outside, beyond the doors, men loitered in shadow, waiting for stragglers to stumble into the night. Within, the very cups raised in cheer might carry bitterness more enduring than wine. Poison, though rare, was never unimagined. A subtle change in color, a faint bitterness masked beneath spice, a guest falling silent sooner than expected. Such fears never wholly left the mind of those who dined under candle and torch. Yet the ritual of the feast demanded trust, or at least its appearance. To refuse a cup, to turn aside a dish, to decline a toast was to reveal suspicion, and suspicion was itself a blade in such company. Thus men and women smiled, lifting their goblets, even as they measured each swallow with a careful heart. The hall, then, became both sanctuary and snare, a place where human frailty and ambition entwined beneath the guise of celebration. The architecture itself seemed complicit in this drama. Long tables pressed men and women into proximity, forcing closeness where enmity might have lingered. Narrow windows allowed only thin shafts of moonlight, so that torches dominated vision, their smoke blurring the air and obscuring expressions. Stone, though solid, carried sound with uncanny clarity. A whispered word might be caught by an ear across the room, magnified in meaning. The very floor, covered with rushes, absorbed spills and footprints alike, swallowing small traces of what had transpired. Outside the hall, the night deepened further. Dogs barked in distant courtyards, answering one another with mournful voices. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl uttered its long, hollow cry, the sound drifting through cold air like a lament. The contrast was sharp. Within, warmth and fire, the close scent of meat and wine. Without, the vast, unlit dark, stretching over fields and forests. Those who left the hall stepped from one world into another, from brightness into obscurity, from noise into silence, where every shadow might hold more than simple emptiness. The feast itself was never a single moment, but a sequence. First came the greeting, the exchange of courtesies, the measured politeness of rank and station. Then the serving, wave after wave of dishes, accompanied by music, flutes, drums, the gentle plucking of strings. Later still, the contests of jest and riddle, the boasting of hunts and battles, the murmured bargains sealed with clasped hands beneath the table's edge. At last, as torches waned, came the drifting departure, guests rising unsteadily, servants guiding them toward chambers or into the night. Each stage left its own residue, its own set of possibilities, its own shade of danger. And through it all, the hall endured, absorbing every murmur and sigh, each ring of metal, each soft fall of ash from torch or hearth. By dawn it would be emptied, the trestles taken down, the floor swept, the embers raked. Yet traces would remain. A stain upon the reed-strewn floor, a lost buckle, a fragment of bread hardened at the edge of the hearth. These fragments were the hall's memory, evidence of moments both grand and perilous, preserved in silence until the next gathering unfolded. The medieval feast, seen in such light, was both spectacle and snare. It displayed wealth and cultivated unity, yet beneath its surface ran currents of rivalry and risk. Firelight softened faces, but it also deepened shadows. Music filled the ear, yet it could not drown the whisper of suspicion. The feast was a mirror, reflecting not only joy but also the restless undercurrents of human ambition. As night stretched toward its end, the hall grew quieter still. Servants moved with measured steps, gathering what remained. The last torches guttered low, their smoke mingling with the faint chill that crept back into the stone. Those who lingered sat heavy-lidded, staring into embers as though reading them for omens. The world beyond the walls waited in silence, patient, as if the darkness itself were listening. And when at last the final flame faltered, when only the faintest glow marked the heart of the hearth, the hall surrendered to stillness. It was as though the building itself exhaled, its labors done, its secrets tucked away. Outside, dawn lay still distant, but within, silence claimed every corner. The feast had passed, leaving behind both memory and mystery, and the hall slept, dreaming of the voices it had carried through the long night. The dawn following a feast was always quieter than most mornings. Where once the hall had rung with voices and music, there now lingered only the hush of cooling embers and the faint creak of wood contracting in the chill. The rushes upon the floor, trampled and scattered, carried the imprint of boots and shoes, some ground into dampness where wine or gravy had spilled. Servants moved through the dim light with deliberate care, gathering vessels of pewter, wiping trenchers, and shaking out cloths stiffened by grease. Their footsteps made soft sounds upon the reed-strewn ground, as though they were walking through memory itself. The world outside was also subdued. Mist clung to the earth in low folds, masking hedges, fences, and the distant rise of hills. The scent of dew mixed with the heavier odors of yesterday's feast, seeping from doorways and shutters. Dogs nosed along the periphery, searching for scraps, their breaths leaving pale clouds in the air. The clatter of buckets from the well mingled with the first crow of roosters, summoning the village from its slumber. Yet even in daylight, a faint heaviness remained, a kind of echo from the long night, as though the shadows of the feast had not entirely departed. Those who had drunk deeply stirred more slowly, rising from chambers heavy-headed, their mouths dry, their limbs stiff. Nobles accustomed to ceremony moved with practiced dignity, despite the weariness beneath their eyes. They wrapped themselves in cloaks and furs, stepping into the new day as though the hall still demanded their performance. For some, the feast had been victory, a chance to display wealth, to hint at power, to confirm alliances with gestures and glances. For others, the gathering had stirred unease, reminding them of grudges unresolved, suspicions unspoken, the sense that a cup or a smile might have concealed more than it revealed. The hall, now emptied of celebration, looked different. Without the torches and the noise of revelry, its vastness returned. The rafters loomed in gray daylight, their soot-darkened beams stretching above like the ribs of a silent cathedral. The hearth, still glowing faintly, seemed smaller without the gathering around it. Every corner reclaimed its shadows, and the banners hanging from the walls drooped heavily, their bright colors dulled in the morning's pale light. It was in these quiet hours that secrets were most easily imagined. A whispered exchange overheard the night before might replay in memory, magnified by silence. A falter in a guest's step, a sudden paleness of the face, an absence noted among the tables. These details, easily overlooked in the rush of feasting, now stood out sharply in recollection. The feast, when stripped of its music and fire, revealed the bare outlines of its intrigues. The dangers of such gatherings were not always immediate. A misplaced word, spoken over wine, could linger like a seed, germinating in suspicion or anger long after the torches had burned down. Promises exchanged with too much haste might become shackles in the days to come. The feast was not only an event, it was a stage from which ripples extended outward, altering the lives of those who took part, sometimes in ways they could not yet perceive. Outside, the village resumed its rhythms. Bakers stoked ovens with dry faggots of wood, the smell of warming bread spreading through narrow lanes. Blacksmiths worked bellows to wake their forges, sparks leaping into the mist. Children carried water, their chatter breaking through the quiet as they ran with wooden pails swinging. Yet in the manor and its surrounding estate, the air still carried the residue of the night's gathering. The peasants who had glimpsed their lords at table remembered the laughter and the torches, and they spoke of it among themselves with wonder, sometimes envy, and sometimes unease. For the grandeur of the feast was not their world, but it touched them nonetheless, shaping the authority that governed their days. Within the Lord's chamber, tapestries shifted gently in the draught. The heavy curtains around the bed held the faint scent of smoke, wool, and dried herbs hung months before to ward off illness. The Lord himself rose with care, his joints stiffened by the cold, his thoughts already turning toward what the feast had concealed as much as what it had revealed. For he knew, as all rulers did, that celebration was never free of purpose. Those who came to his table came not only to eat and drink, but to watch, to measure, to weigh his strength against their own. The ladies of the household, too, felt the aftertaste of the feast. Their dresses, now hung away, bore stains of grease or wine that no washing might wholly remove. Their hair, once perfumed and set with careful braids, now carried the faint smell of smoke from the torches. In their minds lingered impressions of glances across the table, of whispered remarks caught between the notes of a song, of laughter that rang a little too loudly or silence that pressed too heavily. They had played their roles with grace, but each one left the hall with questions unspoken. And the servants, invisible during the feast, now moved openly. They carried platters to be scrubbed, dragged rushes to the midden, emptied jugs and flasks. They remembered much of what others forgot, for their ears had caught the words that slipped when wine loosened tongues. They had seen the hand that trembled, the guest who rose too soon, the noble who pressed too firmly on another's shoulder. Their memories, though unspoken, were the hidden ledger of the household, a record of truths beneath the glittering surface. By midday, the hall began to recover its usual order. Fresh rushes were spread across the floor, sprinkled with sweet herbs to mask the lingering odors. The hearth was stoked to new life, smoke curling once more toward the rafters. Benches were returned to their places, and tables were cleared away, leaving the central space open. What had been a place of feast now resumed its role as the heart of daily life, a place for gathering, for judgment, for the rhythms of the household. Yet beneath its renewed order, the memory of the feast lingered, like embers beneath ash, ready to glow again when stirred. The darker side of such feasts was rarely spoken aloud, yet all who took part carried it within them. To eat and drink together was to share trust, but also to court danger. A feast might mask betrayal with laughter, might veil ambition with courtesy. The very closeness of bodies and voices, pressed together under one roof, ensured that secrets brushed against one another like sparks in dry straw. Most nights passed without fire, but the possibility remained, and that possibility was enough to lend every gathering its tension. As twilight approached once more, the world seemed to prepare itself for another cycle. Shadows lengthened across fields, crows returned to their roosts, and the first stars pricked the sky. The hall stood in its solemn strength, its stone walls cooling in the evening air, its banners stirring faintly with each breath of wind. The memory of the last feast had not yet faded, and already the thought of the next stirred in minds both noble and common. For in the medieval world, the feast was both necessity and danger, both joy and shadow. It bound people together even as it reminded them of the distances between them. Thus the hall endured, its silence holding all the voices of the past night, waiting for the next gathering, the next performance, the next weaving of light and shadow. In that endurance lay its mystery, for though the tables would be cleared, and the embers raked, and the floors strewn anew, the hall never truly forgot. And so the day after the feast came to its close, quiet and unassuming. The dangers that had hovered in the firelight retreated into memory, yet they did not vanish. They lingered, like faint shapes in mist, waiting for the moment when laughter and music would again call them forth from shadow into the living world. The hall, though central, was never the whole story of a feast. Beyond its stone and timber, beyond the firelight and smoke, lived those who gave it meaning, the men and women whose presence filled it, whose gestures and silences shaped its tone. To understand the feast was to understand them. Not only their roles but the subtle language of their movements, the unspoken sentences written in the tilt of a head, the restlessness of a hand, the stillness of a gaze. At the highest table, beneath banners that spoke of lineage and claim, the lord of the household sat. His years had bent him only slightly, his shoulders still broad beneath the fur-lined cloak that draped across them. His hands bore the marks of both battle and governance. Scars across the knuckles, fingers thickened by use, the nails clean but uneven. His beard, streaked with iron gray, carried the faint scent of smoke from the torches, as though the hall itself had marked him. His movements were deliberate, each gesture weighted with meaning. When he lifted a goblet, it was not only to drink but to declare. His steadiness was reassurance, his willingness to share a toast a sign of unity. His eyes, however, betrayed the vigilance that never rested. They moved continually, watching not only the hall but the people within it, measuring each shift of expression. To some, his look was warmth, a reminder of favor. To others, it was a reminder of the gaze that never forgot. Even in laughter, even in the moment of a song, the watchfulness remained. For a lord's power lay not only in his sword or his seal but in his perception. Beside him, his lady bore herself with poise. Her garments, carefully arranged, seemed to float rather than hang, the folds of wool and silk chosen with attention to color and to light. Her hands, slim and pale, moved with unstudied grace as she lifted morsels of food or traced the rim of a cup. Where her husband's presence commanded, hers soothed. She smiled easily, inclining her head just enough to flatter, offering words that balanced the weight of his silence. Yet behind her composure lay her own calculations. She too watched the hall, though in different measure. She noticed the way one noble leaned too close to another, the way another's laughter rang sharp, the moment a servant's hand trembled when passing a dish. Her power was not displayed in arms or decree, but in memory, in the careful weaving of knowledge into quiet influence. Their children, seated according to age and custom, reflected them in smaller measure. The eldest son sat upright, his jaw firm, his gaze fixed ahead. His clothing bore brighter colors than his father's, declaring youth and promise. Yet his hands fidgeted beneath the table, betraying nerves he thought hidden. He longed to appear equal to the lords around him, but his mind chased itself in circles, rehearsing the gestures of command he had yet to master. The younger children, less bound by formality, shifted in their seats with restlessness. They whispered to one another behind lowered hands, stealing bites of sweetmeats too quickly, their laughter stifled by glares from tutors or nurses. They were the future, not yet molded, their innocence both a relief and a vulnerability in a hall where nothing passed unmeasured. Beyond the high table stretched the long trestles where guests sat. Each figure there carried a story, a set of habits and marks that spoke of life lived in shadow or light. Some bore the fine fabrics of wealth, velvets dyed in deep blues and crimsons, silks that caught torchlight like water. Others wore humbler wool, thick and serviceable, marked by travel and weather. Rings gleamed on a few hands, signifying ties to land or to favor. At their belts hung daggers, some jeweled, some plain, but all functional, symbols of both necessity and distrust. One knight, broad of chest and thick in beard, sat heavily, his every motion carrying the memory of battlefields. His laugh was deep but edged, like a weapon that had not been sheathed long enough. When he raised his goblet, wine spilled along his hand, and he wiped it carelessly upon his tunic. His scars were not only on his face but in the stiffness of his movements, in the way he turned too sharply, as if expecting blows even in safety. Another guest, more slender, sat in silence. His cloak was finely woven, his boots polished, yet his hands were restless, folding and unfolding the cloth of his lap. His gaze moved often to the high table, then away again, as if measuring a distance he longed to bridge but feared to cross. His silence was not absence but calculation. He listened with an intensity that gave weight to his stillness, as though every word spoken in the hall fell into a ledger only he could see. Among the women at the trestles were figures no less complex. One, richly adorned with pearls in her hair, leaned forward when she spoke, her gestures bright, her laughter carrying beyond her companions. Her beauty was undeniable, yet it was her voice that drew attention, the tone of someone accustomed to being heard. Beside her, another woman sat quieter, her head slightly bowed, her gown of modest hue, yet her eyes, half hidden, flickered with quick intelligence, marking each exchange around her. She was less noticed, and because of that, she saw more. The servants, too, though often unseen, carried their own weight of character. One young boy, tasked with pouring wine, moved nervously among the benches, his steps too quick, his hands unsteady. The older steward, stern and measured, followed his progress with a sharp gaze, correcting each misstep with a raised eyebrow or a clipped whisper. A girl, no older than 14, balanced platters with practiced skill, her face expressionless though the heat of the hearth had flushed her cheeks. Their presence was essential, and though they were seldom spoken to directly, they were always near, always listening. Even the musicians had their place in this tapestry of figures. Seated at the edge of the hall, their instruments gleaming faintly in firelight, they played with patience, their eyes lowered, their bodies swaying gently with the rhythm. Yet they, too, observed. The tapping of a noble's fingers against the table, the restlessness of feet beneath benches, the way voices rose or fell with each new song. They measured the hall as carefully as any steward, for their task was not only to provide sound but to shape the mood of those who listened. Thus the feast was never only food and drink. It was a gathering of presences, each layered upon the other, each revealing something more than words alone could declare. The lord's steady gaze, the lady's poised smile, the knight's careless strength, the merchant's restless silence, the lady's bold laughter, the servant's trembling hand. All of these formed the true fabric of the hall. Beneath the banners and the firelight, It was the human texture that gave the feast its depth. As the evening deepened, these figures moved in subtle ways. The Lord leaned slightly toward one guest, listening more intently than before. The lady shifted her attention to another corner, her smile softening a moment of tension. The night grew louder, his laughter masking an unease that crept into his voice. The quiet merchant raised his cup at last, his eyes glinting with something half-hidden. Each gesture, each moment, added to the unspoken story that lay beneath the feast's surface. And in the hall, where light flickered and shadows swayed, these stories entwined. Some would fade when the torches burned low, forgotten by dawn. Others would linger, shaping alliances, planting doubts, altering the course of days yet to come. The feast was a mirror of its people, each figure casting both light and shadow, each presence a reminder that celebration could never be wholly separate from danger. When the night drew near its end, the faces of those present seemed softened, blurred by wine and weariness. Yet even in that softened state, their essence remained. The Lord vigilant, the lady watchful in silence, the knight restless in strength, the merchant cloaked in calculation, the women bright and quiet alike, the servants invisible yet enduring. Together they formed the living memory of the hall, a memory that, like the stone and timber, would endure long after the fire had cooled. And so the figures withdrew, one by one, leaving behind the traces of their presence. The echo of laughter, the whisper of fabric, the faint impression of a hand upon a goblet. The hall absorbed it all, storing it in silence, as though every feast were but a chapter in its endless story. The feast, though filled with voices, torches, and the shimmer of goblets, never stood apart from its wider world. It was not merely an indulgence of appetite or a pause in the calendar. It was a part of the fabric of life, woven tightly into the threads of power, tradition, and survival. To understand its meaning was to look beyond the hall itself, into the currents of history and the shadows of the age that sustained it. Medieval life was bound by cycles. The turning of the seasons, the tolling of bells, the slow passage from dawn to dusk. Each cycle dictated labor and rest, hunger and abundance, silence and celebration. Feasts marked the rhythm of that passage, punctuating time with moments of intensity. They were both anchor and display, reminders that amidst toil, danger, and faith, there was still a place for ceremony, for gathering, for shared bread and wine. Yet the feast was never simply a matter of sustenance. The very abundance it represented was a declaration of survival. In a world where poor harvests could mean hunger for months, to set a table heavy with meats, fish, bread, and spice was to proclaim not only wealth but security. It was a statement that this house, this lord, this lineage could command plenty, even in seasons when others struggled. Thus, the feast was as political as it was pleasurable, a stage upon which strength was displayed in roasted capon and in goblets of imported wine. The risks of scarcity haunted every banquet. A single bad harvest, a blight upon the fields, or a disruption in trade could empty pantries and cellars. Yet on feast days, such fears were masked by ritual. To appear weak, to offer too little, was to admit vulnerability. Nobles stretched their resources, sometimes beyond safety, to ensure their tables bore enough to impress. The peasants might be hungry, but within the hall, trenchers were filled and refilled, goblets poured without pause, platters of roasted meat carried forth as though the land itself were inexhaustible. It was theater as much as hospitality, a performance meant to reassure allies and remind rivals. The politics of the feast reached far beyond food. Who sat where at the tables, who was placed near the lord or kept at the distant benches, who received choice cuts or lesser portions, each detail carried weight. Seating arrangements were declarations in themselves, subtle hierarchies displayed for all eyes to see. A guest placed at the high table could leave with honor renewed. Another placed too far away might brood upon an insult, whether intended or not. The table, then, was not only for eating. It was a map of power, an arrangement of status that everyone read in silence. Beneath the formality lay the older traditions of fellowship. To eat together was to bind oneself, if only temporarily, to the company present. Bread torn and shared, wine poured from the same pitcher, meat taken from the same platter. These gestures created a bond. They declared trust, or at least the appearance of it. Yet therein lay the darker undertone. To share food was to open oneself to danger, for any dish or cup could be turned to betrayal. Poison was the fear whispered beneath every banquet. Though true cases were rare, the suspicion was constant, enough that tasters were often employed, enough that a sudden illness after a feast might draw long shadows of accusation. It was not only poison that haunted the feast. Theft was common in such gatherings, the crowd and the revelry providing perfect cover. A dagger might vanish from a belt, a purse from a cloak, a jewel from a lady's sleeve. Drunkenness left some careless, their vigilance dulled, their possessions forgotten. Outside the hall, where night pressed heavily, worse dangers lurked. Guests departing late might find themselves followed, their path through the village watched by those who waited in darkness. A stumble on a rutted road, a pause in the mist, and shadows could close quickly. The feast gave opportunity not only for fellowship but for crime. Even within, assaults and quarrels were not unknown. Wine loosened tempers as easily as tongues. Rivalries, restrained in daylight, might flare beneath the smoky torches. A careless word, a laugh too loud, a gesture too bold could spark sudden conflict. Though open violence was rare in noble halls, the possibility hung like smoke in the rafters. Servants moved quickly at such moments, attempting to cool anger with more wine or to distract with a song, for they knew too well how swiftly joy could sour into strife. And yet, despite these risks, feasts persisted. Indeed, they grew ever more elaborate, ever more central to the life of the age. For the dangers were part of their meaning. To survive a feast, to emerge with alliances intact and honor unblemished, was itself a triumph. The hall was a crucible, testing not only appetite but judgment, patience, and restraint. Those who navigated it successfully increased their standing. Those who faltered bore the weight of whispers long after the candles were extinguished. Beyond the nobility, the wider world also felt the pull of the feast. Villagers glimpsed the glow of torches, heard the distant music, smelled the rich scents drifting on the night air. For them, it was a reminder of the gulf between their daily labor and the grandeur within the hall. Yet it was also a source of pride, a proof that their lord could host with dignity, that their land produced enough to sustain such abundance. In some seasons, the lord allowed villagers their own celebration in the courtyard or village green, a reflection of the greater feast above. Thus, even the poorest shared in the rhythm, if only in shadowed imitation. Church and faith, too, shaped the nature of the feast. Many gatherings were tied to holy days, to saints' festivals, or to the turning of the liturgical year. Priests blessed the tables, sprinkling holy water over bread and wine, sanctifying the act of eating as a reflection of divine bounty. Yet even here shadows lingered. The church warned often against excess, against gluttony and drunkenness, reminding all that the body was not only vessel but temptation. The feast was both sacred and dangerous, a place where gratitude and sin walked side by side. The air of deception lay always close. A smile across the table might conceal resentment, a gift of wine might mask suspicion, a toast might disguise ambition. Feasts created a facade of unity, a picture of harmony painted in firelight. Yet beneath the laughter and the clatter of trenchers, divisions remained. Families still contested land, neighbors still disputed rights, rivalries still simmered, waiting for their moment. The feast was less a resolution than a pause, a temporary smoothing of surface tensions, as fragile as the flame of a torch swaying in draft. And when the feast ended, the world resumed with all its weight. Disputes returned, alliances were tested, hunger crept back into daily life. The feast was both escape and mirror. Escape from toil into abundance, mirror of the conflicts and fears that never wholly departed. In this way, the medieval feast revealed both the light and the darkness of its age. It was a place of splendor, of fellowship, of ritual and joy. It was also a place of risk, of deception, of rivalry and shadow. The hall, in its vastness, contained both. And those who entered it knew, even if only in the quiet recesses of their minds, that the firelight which brightened faces also deepened the shadows behind them. As night fell once more, the hall stood silent, its walls cool, its hearth dark. But memory clung to it like smoke, reminding all who passed within that the feast was never merely celebration. It was a stage upon which the darkest side of fellowship might whisper its presence, a reminder that beneath unity there always lay the possibility of betrayal. When torches were extinguished and the hall surrendered to silence, the true weight of the feast began to unfold. For what had been spoken lightly in firelight often lingered heavily in memory. What had been veiled in laughter revealed itself in recollection as sharp, unsettling truth. In the chambers of nobles and in the narrow cots of servants, thoughts stirred long after music had faded, and the shadows of the gathering grew larger in the quiet of the night. The Lord, who had sat steady at the high table, lay awake longer than most. His body, wearied by age and wine, longed for sleep, yet his mind refused rest. He turned upon his bed, the tapestries above him swaying gently with the draught. In his memory he rehearsed the feast again, but not for its pleasures. He thought instead of each subtle detail, the guest who avoided his gaze, the merchant who lifted his goblet with too much haste, the knight whose laugh rang with forced mirth. Each fragment was weighed, as carefully as he would weigh accounts of grain or tallies of coin. For the feast was never a simple pleasure to him. It was a ledger of loyalties and dangers, its columns written in glances and gestures. His lady, beside him, closed her eyes but felt the same restlessness. Her part in the feast had been played with poise, her smile offered generously, her words smooth and kind. Yet she, too, remembered what lay beneath. She recalled the lady with pearls in her hair, laughing too brightly, leaning too close to the young knight beside her. She recalled the silence of another woman, whose lowered head concealed eyes that missed nothing. She recalled the way a servant trembled when pouring wine for a certain guest, as though aware of something unspoken. Her power lay not in command but in memory, and she carried these memories carefully, storing them like precious spices against the day they might be needed. Their eldest son, young and eager, dreamed of the feast with a restless pride. To him it was proof of belonging, of stepping into the world of men. He remembered the goblet in his hand, the weight of it, the warmth of wine upon his tongue. He remembered the glances directed toward him, measuring him as heir. Yet his dreams were not wholly sweet, for beneath his pride stirred unease. Had he spoken too little or too much? Had his hand trembled when he lifted the cup? In his youthful mind, each detail loomed large, and the feast became not only a memory but a test, one in which he was never certain of his standing. Elsewhere in the manor, the knight whose laughter had filled the hall lay awake in his chamber. The fire in his hearth had burned low, casting only faint light upon the walls. His body bore scars, his limbs ached with old wounds, yet it was not pain that kept him from sleep. It was memory. He recalled the wine spilled upon his hand, the careless way he had wiped it away, the eyes that had noticed, the murmurs that might follow. In battle he was strong. In the hall he felt clumsy, his strength turned against him. He knew too well that a careless gesture could echo longer than a victory in the field. In another room, the quiet merchant sat alone by a small lamp. He had left the hall without speaking much, yet his silence had been full of listening. Now, in solitude, he sifted through the words he had heard, arranging them in his mind like coins upon a table. Each phrase was measured, each glance considered, each laugh interpreted. He thought of the Lord's steady gaze, of the lady's smile, of the way others leaned toward one another. In silence he built his picture, a map of rivalries and alliances, a chart of currents that might be navigated in the days to come. For him the feast was not an end but a beginning, a resource to be drawn upon in future bargains. The lady adorned with pearls, who had laughed brightly and drawn attention, sat before her polished mirror. She removed each jewel slowly, setting it aside with deliberate care. Her laughter had been genuine in part, but also sharpened with intent. She knew the power of her presence, the attention she commanded. Yet as she studied her reflection, she wondered if she had shown too much, if her gestures had revealed more than she wished. The hall was both her stage and her snare, and though she carried herself with confidence, she was not free of unease. The quieter woman, seated beside her during the feast, knelt at her bedside in prayer. Her voice was low, her words steady, yet her mind wandered from her prayers to the faces she had seen. She thought of the merchant's stillness, of the knight's careless mirth, of the Lord's watchful eyes. She asked for protection, not only from hunger and sickness, but from the dangers that clothed themselves in laughter and courtesy. Her humility gave her little power, yet her memory granted her its own quiet strength. Even the servants carried their memories into the night. The boy who had spilled wine upon a guest's sleeve lay restless upon his straw mattress, replaying the moment again and again. He feared punishment, feared dismissal, feared that his clumsiness had been noted too widely. The girl who had borne heavy platters without falter lay more peacefully, though her body ached from strain. She thought of the faces she had seen, not with calculation but with the curiosity of youth. She wondered what it meant to laugh so loudly, to sit so proudly, to drink so deeply. Her world was smaller, yet the feast had opened its doors to her, if only in glimpses. Thus the feast extended beyond its own night, weaving itself into dreams and thoughts, shaping the waking hours of those who took part. It was a gathering that never ended wholly when the torches burned out. It lived on in memory, in reflection, in the subtle adjustments of trust and suspicion. It was as though the feast had its own afterlife, echoing through chambers, cottages, and silent corridors, binding all who had attended in its lingering shadow. Morning brought new clarity, but the shadows of the feast remained. The Lord summoned his steward, questioning quietly about what had been observed. The lady sent a servant with gifts to certain guests, gestures chosen not at random but with purpose. The merchant penned notes by lamplight, preparing messages for riders to carry. The knight strode to the courtyard, his heavy boots striking stone with force, as though to remind all that strength could silence rumor. The ladies resumed their work with needle and thread, yet their minds still circled around glances and gestures. The servants whispered among themselves in corners, their voices hushed but insistent. Thus, the feast did not end with its music. It continued in whispers and in glances, in decisions and in doubts. It shaped the path of days, pressing its mark upon all who had sat within the hall. It was a mirror held to human ambition and frailty, reflecting both the grace and the darkness of the age. By evening, the hall itself seemed unchanged. Its rafters high, its banners still, its hearth newly stoked. Yet those who entered it felt the difference, as though the very stones remembered. The feast lingered in silence, in smoke, in the faint marks upon the rushes. It was more than a memory. It was a presence, quiet but enduring, shaping the future as surely as it had filled the past. And so, as another dusk drew its veil across the land, the hall stood ready again, solemn and patient. It knew, as those who entered it also knew, that every feast was more than food and laughter. It was a crucible where trust and betrayal met, where unity and rivalry entwined, where the brightest firelight always cast the deepest shadows. The rhythm of days following a feast often carried a subtle weight, for the echoes of that night lingered longer than the smoke upon the rafters. When the sun returned to the high sky and the sound of work filled the manor again, the traces of merriment seemed to have faded. Yet beneath the outward return to order, the feast's memory remained, like an undercurrent too steady to be denied. Travelers passing along the road saw little change in the stone walls that guarded the hall, nor in the tilled fields that spread outward from its base. Oxen still pulled the plow, their slow strength breaking the earth for sowing. Women bent over their tasks with practiced patience, their hands red from washing, their voices low in song. The blacksmith's hammer struck its steady rhythm, echoing across the yard like a bell of iron. To outward sight, all seemed as it had been before. Yet within the manor walls, the atmosphere had shifted, softened here, tightened there, as though invisible threads had been pulled or loosened by unseen hands. For in that age, feasts were not moments apart from life but woven deeply into it. They were pauses that revealed truths otherwise hidden. The measure of loyalty, the silence of doubt, the trembling of ambition. And once revealed, these truths could not easily be concealed again. The lord of the hall, when he rose each morning to pace the courtyard, walked with a measured gravity. His cloak hung heavily upon his shoulders, though not from age alone. He had seen too many gatherings where cheer dissolved into strife, too many oaths sworn beneath banners that later tore in the wind. As he watched the men training in the yard, their wooden swords striking with dull thuds, his thoughts turned not only to their strength but to the feasts that might soon test their loyalty. He knew well that the sword was sharpened not only for battlefields but for silent struggles at the table, where a poisoned goblet or a whispered accusation could be as deadly as steel. Beyond the walls, the land itself carried the marks of unrest. Though the harvest had been fair, storms had struck hard in the spring, and certain villages bore the scars of hunger. Men who had once labored contentedly now cast uneasy glances toward their lords, whispering of burdens too heavy, of promises too light. In such times, feasts took on heavier meaning. They were not only displays of plenty but assertions of power, proof that the lord could feed his household, clothe his guests, maintain abundance where others knew want. Yet abundance, displayed too boldly, could also stir envy and suspicion, and more than one feast had kindled the smoldering embers of revolt. Messengers on horseback carried tidings from other halls. Some bore news of marriages arranged, alliances forged across rivers and forests. Others brought darker words, rumors of plots, whispers of treachery, distant battles whose outcomes were uncertain. Each letter, each word delivered in haste, entered the hall as quietly as a shadow, yet remained long after parchment was folded away. For every message was weighed, not only for what it said but for what it did not say, and the silence between lines was often louder than the words themselves. In such a climate, feasts were never mere celebrations. They were councils in disguise, stages where the unspoken was performed before all eyes. The Lord understood this, as did his lady, as did every guest who sat beneath the glow of torchlight. None were free of the knowledge that food might hide poison, that laughter might cover calculation, that unity might be a mask worn thin over rivalry. And yet the feasts continued. They had to. To deny them was to deny custom, to betray expectation, to leave the hall silent when it should resound with music. And so invitations were written, messengers dispatched, preparations begun anew. The hearth was swept clean, the storerooms replenished, the cooks set once more to their endless labor. In this repetition lay a strange comfort, as though the rituals themselves promised protection, though all knew how fragile that promise might be. When the guests returned, days or weeks later, they brought with them not only fine garments and eager appetites, but also the weight of new knowledge, fresh rumors, and unspoken intentions. The hall filled again with sound and light, the smell of roasting meats, the sweetness of spiced wine. Servants hurried in their tasks, bearing platters with trembling arms, careful not to falter. Musicians struck their strings, their melodies drifting upward into the smoky air. All seemed as before, and yet each detail carried its own meaning, subtle but undeniable. One might note how a knight seated himself closer to the merchant than to his fellow men-at-arms, or how a lady inclined her head more deeply to one guest than to another. One might note the absence of a face once familiar, excused by sickness or by duty, but whispered about nonetheless. One might note how the Lord's gaze lingered longer than before upon his son, measuring not only his strength but his discretion, his ability to hold his tongue as well as wield his sword. The banquet table thus became a tapestry more intricate than any woven cloth. Every movement was a thread, every word a stitch, forming patterns visible only to the patient eye. And just as a tapestry revealed its image only when seen in full, so too did the feast reveal its meaning only in time, when each glance and gesture was recalled and compared against those that came after. It was in such gatherings that alliances were tested most severely. A smile could conceal doubt, a jest could sting like a blade, a raised goblet could be a pledge or a warning. To the eye untrained, it was merriment. To the eye sharpened by caution, it was a battlefield without blood, where the victors walked away crowned not with laurel but with quiet advantage. Outside, night deepened as candles burned low. The air grew heavy with the mingled scents of wine, wax, and smoke. The music softened, the laughter dulled, until only murmurs remained. Yet it was often in these quieter hours that truths emerged most starkly. For when weariness loosened tongues and shadows lengthened upon stone, words were spoken that daylight might never allow. Thus, a feast became not only a celebration of abundance but a testing ground of trust. It was a place where the strongest were not always those with swords in hand, but those who listened longest, remembered most keenly, and spoke least. When at last the guests withdrew once more, when the torches sputtered and the rushes were swept away, the hall seemed to sigh with relief. Silence returned, but not peace, for the silence itself was heavy, charged with the memory of words spoken and unspoken, of gestures made and withheld. It was the silence of a battlefield after the clash, when the air still trembled though the swords lay still. In that silence, the Lord sat long by the embers of the hearth. He felt the warmth fade from the stones, watched the smoke curl upward into darkness, and thought of all that had passed. The feast had ended, yet its shadow lay before him, stretching into days yet to come. For he knew, as did all who bore the weight of power, that a feast was never truly past. It was only a chapter, one among many, in a longer story written in hunger and in hope, in loyalty and in betrayal. And as sleep at last descended upon the hall, slow and unrelenting. The echoes of the feast faded into dreams, dreams restless with memory, yet softened by the passage of night. The season turned slowly, as though time itself lingered over each passing day, unwilling to release the last warmth of summer into the lengthening shadows of autumn. The land bore the change with dignity. The fields, once golden with grain, now stood bare and waiting, while the orchards grew heavy with fruit. In the air there was the faint scent of ripeness, mixed with the sharper edge of decay, as wind carried fallen leaves across damp earth. Life in the manor moved according to these rhythms, steady, enduring, always preparing for the seasons ahead. Within the hall, the great hearth was stirred to brighter flame each evening. Logs, thick with resin, hissed as they burned, filling the air with a smoky sweetness that mingled with the scent of herbs hung above to dry. Servants moved through the space with practiced ease, bringing in bundles of rushes to scatter upon the floor, replacing the soiled ones with fresh. The sound of their steps upon the stone echoed briefly before being swallowed by the thickness of the walls. It was a time of gathering, not only of food but of information. Messengers continued to arrive from distant holdings, their cloaks travel-stained, their horses weary. Each bore tidings, some of good harvest, some of misfortune, some of unrest in villages where the Lord's demands pressed too hard upon shoulders already bent. These messages, received by steward and lord alike, were absorbed into the quiet current of thought that flowed beneath every decision. For to govern was not only to command in the open but to listen in silence, to weigh carefully what might yet come to pass. It was also the time when feasts became both more urgent and more dangerous. As the chill deepened, gatherings took on a double meaning: warmth shared against the encroaching cold, yet also displays of strength at a moment when supplies thinned. The bounty laid upon a table was no longer merely for pleasure. It was proof of foresight, of power, of command over land and people. To provide when the earth began to withdraw its gifts was to declare a kind of sovereignty, while to falter was to invite suspicion. Thus, invitations were once again sent outward. Lords and knights, merchants and envoys, made their way toward the hall, their cloaks thick, their faces set against the wind. With them they carried not only expectations of hospitality, but also the subtle weight of alliances and rivalries. Every seat filled at the table would speak louder than words, for presence itself was a declaration, and absence a louder one still. Preparations within the hall unfolded with the same meticulous care as before, yet now with heightened intensity. The cooks labored endlessly, stirring pots that steamed with the fragrance of spices imported at great cost. Venison was roasted slowly, turning on spits as fat hissed upon the fire. Breads were baked thick and crusted, served alongside butter beaten smooth in heavy churns. Honey, drawn from summer's hives, was warmed until it flowed like amber over dishes set to impress the eye as much as the tongue. The musicians too rehearsed with greater zeal, tuning their instruments until the strings resonated clear against the stone. They knew well that their melodies must weave through the air like a balm, smoothing over tensions, disguising the pauses between words, softening the sharp edges of glances exchanged across the table. Music, though gentle, carried a subtle power, for it filled the spaces that might otherwise invite suspicion. When the night of gathering arrived, the hall once more transformed. Torchlight danced across the beams, casting shadows that shifted like silent spectators along the walls. The guests entered in cloaks heavy with travel, laying aside hoods and gloves to reveal faces marked by the journey. The servants moved swiftly to take their belongings, offering cups of warmed wine spiced with cloves to banish the chill from their bones. The long tables were soon crowded with figures whose names carried weight, each seated according to rank, each placement carefully considered. The lord and his lady presided at the high table, their presence calm, deliberate, commanding without flourish. The first courses were brought forth, steaming dishes placed in precise order, each meant to reassure and to impress. At first, the hall was filled with sound, laughter, greetings, the clatter of knives upon trenchers. Yet, as the courses advanced, the rhythm shifted. The words grew quieter, the glances sharper, the silences longer. Beneath the outward cheer there moved a tide of caution, as though each guest measured not only the food upon the table, but the intent behind it. Some watched the servants too closely, tracing each movement of the cupbearer's hand, noting who poured for whom, who drank swiftly and who delayed. Others leaned slightly toward their neighbors, whispering words just low enough to evade capture, yet unmistakable in their weight. The air grew dense, not with smoke but with unspoken truths that hovered between the guests. It was in these moments that the darker side of feasting revealed itself most clearly. Poison was the fear most often spoken of, yet it was but one danger among many. The more insidious threat lay in perception. The possibility that one might be thought disloyal, or too eager, or too reserved. A misplaced jest could echo longer than a pledge. A pause in lifting a cup could be read as doubt, and a glance held too long might seed suspicion that no oath could dispel. As the feast stretched onward, the weight of such subtle dangers pressed upon each guest. For the hall, though warm, was no sanctuary from fear. It was instead a mirror in which each man and woman saw not only their own place but the reflection of how others might perceive them. In that mirror, small flaws seemed larger, small doubts magnified, until even the strongest could feel the strain. And yet, all endured. They smiled when required, raised their goblets when expected, and offered thanks to their host with the steady tones of courtesy. For to falter was to risk far more than mere embarrassment. It was to risk position, trust, even survival. When at last the feast neared its close, when candles sputtered low and shadows lengthened across the floor, there came a subtle easing of tension. The music softened into gentler strains, the conversations thinned into murmurs. Guests leaned back in weariness, their faces pale with wine and fatigue. Servants cleared away the final dishes, their movements slow, careful, respectful of the hour. The Lord, seated at the high table, let his gaze travel across the room. He saw not only his guests but the patterns they formed, who had drawn near to whom, who had withdrawn into silence, who had sought to be seen, who had chosen to remain unnoticed. Each choice, each gesture, carried meaning, and he stored them within his mind as carefully as one stores coin within a chest. For in the days to come, when decisions must be made, it would not be the taste of wine he remembered, but these small truths revealed in the glow of torchlight. At last the guests withdrew, their cloaks gathered, their steps heavy with wine and weariness. The night air met them like a blade, sharp and clean, carrying away the warmth of the hall in an instant. Torches guided their way into the darkness beyond the gate, where horses stamped and breathed clouds into the cold. Slowly they departed, their voices fading into silence, leaving the manor to its own stillness once more. Within the hall, the servants worked long into the night, clearing away the remnants of abundance. Bones were gathered for dogs, crumbs swept aside, wax drippings scraped from stone. The rushes, darkened with spilled wine, were gathered and burned, replaced with fresh. The smell of smoke lingered long after, mingling with the faint sweetness of herbs that still hung above. And when all was done, when silence at last settled deep and the fire sank into embers, the hall seemed to breathe again. Its stones, heavy with centuries, absorbed the echoes of laughter and fear, as though storing them for future nights when once more the feast would rise. In that silence, the Lord remained seated by the hearth, his thoughts as steady as the slow collapse of burning logs. He knew the feast had ended, yet its meaning had only begun to unfold. The alliances hinted at, the suspicions awakened, the rivalries renewed. All would echo beyond this night, shaping days to come. The feast was over, but its shadow would linger. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with patient rhythm, carrying leaves across the darkened fields. The stars, cold and distant, watched without judgment. And in their light, the hall stood firm, both sanctuary and snare, its strength as much a burden as a protection. So the night passed, slow and inevitable, carrying with it the memory of abundance shadowed by fear. The feast, though ended, remained within the air, within the stone, within the hearts of all who had gathered. And with the coming dawn, its weight would be carried quietly into the days that followed, woven into the fabric of life as silently as the turning of the seasons themselves. The first light of morning crept over the horizon in soft, silvered threads, brushing the land with a quiet persistence that seemed almost reverent. Dew clung to the grass and to the low-lying leaves, each droplet trembling with its brief reflection of the awakening sky. In the village below the manor, smoke rose lazily from chimneys, the scent of burning peat and wood mingling with the dampness of earth, a humble perfume that spoke of warmth and toil. Footsteps were slow, tentative at first, as the day began without rush, allowing each moment to unfold like a careful drawing of breath. Paths that yesterday had borne carts laden with produce now lay empty and slick with morning moisture. The occasional crow took flight from a gnarled tree, its cawing echoing across the fields, sharp against the gentle hum of awakening life. Horses nickered softly in the stables, their coats gleaming with condensation, heads lowered to the straw, chewing with a patience that reflected the unhurried rhythm of the land. The villagers emerged gradually, their movements deliberate, brushing hands against tunics and cloaks, eyes squinting against the soft light. At the manor, servants moved quietly through the hall, tending fires and replenishing supplies. The embers of the hearth glowed faintly, casting a warm amber on the walls, still echoing faintly with the laughter and murmurs of the feast from the night before. Tables were swept clean, rushes replaced, and the aroma of fresh bread and porridge began to mingle with the lingering scent of herbs. Each motion was measured, purposeful, yet there was a calm in their labor, a gentle continuation of the world beyond the revelry of the previous night. Outside the walls, the land itself seemed to carry echoes of the feast, though in subtler ways. Travelers on the road noted the manor's gates still open, welcoming or watchful, and wondered at the gathering that had passed. Word of the feast traveled slowly, carried by tongues both careful and careless, whispering hints of alliances, rivalries, and the unspoken rules that had governed every gesture at the tables. In small hamlets, neighbors exchanged news in hushed tones, observing the subtle tensions and loyalties that even distant gatherings could inspire. Yet life continued, resilient and steady. Shepherds moved flocks across rolling hills, their crooks tapping softly against damp earth, dogs padding alongside with ears alert. In the woods, the wind rustled branches, and the distant trickle of streams played a quiet symphony of continuity. Even in the fields where the harvest had been gathered, the soil seemed to breathe beneath the plow, waiting for the turn of seasons that would bring new growth. At the manor, the Lord walked among his holdings with measured steps, observing the patterns of life that endured beyond the hall. Each steward and servant, each rider and messenger, moved as part of a subtle choreography, guided by long-practiced knowledge of duties and hierarchies. The Lord's eyes noted small details, the way a cart had been repaired, the alignment of furrows in a field, the posture of a guard as he moved along the walls. These quiet observations carried weight, shaping decisions that would ripple outward, much like the unseen currents beneath the surface of a pond. The dangers hinted at within the feast lingered, though now they were less immediate and more abstract. A village dispute might flare into violence if left unchecked. A careless word could reach the ears of those who would use it to weaken a position. The Lord's mind considered these threads, tracing them gently through the lives of those who served him, aware that vigilance was as much a matter of observation as of command. Even the faintest act, an unsent letter, a delayed messenger, a glance too long or too brief, could alter the delicate balance that maintained order and authority. As the day progressed, shadows lengthened across the walls and rooftops. Children ran along paths, their laughter ringing through the crisp air, a reminder of life's continuity even amid the careful calculations of grown men and women. In gardens, herbs and vegetables thrived, watered and tended with quiet attention, their growth imperceptible yet inevitable. The manor's animals moved about in a measured rhythm, the soft clatter of hooves and the lowing of cattle forming a gentle percussion beneath the more intricate symphony of human activity. By afternoon, the hall took on a different energy. Tasks shifted from preparation to reflection. Ledgers were examined, stores inventoried, and messages read with thoughtful attention. Servants paused briefly to wipe foreheads, their hands smudged with flour or soot, before resuming with deliberate care. Even in these simple motions, there was a rhythm, a sense of continuity that reinforced the strength of the household. Every gesture, no matter how small, contributed to the steady unfolding of life, the careful weaving of order from the chaos that lurked just beyond the walls. And yet, beyond the protective stone, shadows of the previous night's intrigue were not entirely absent. Roads stretching from the manor to distant holdings remained paths for whispers, some carried by those with honest intentions, others by those who sought advantage in silence. Travelers noted the manor's reputation with a mixture of awe and caution. Some marveled at the skill with which the feast had been conducted, the meticulous care in presentation, the subtle grace of hosts and guests alike. Others imagined the hidden threats that had passed unnoticed, the quiet rivalries and fleeting fears that had shaped each gesture around the tables. The evening approached with a gentle sigh. Smoke curled from chimneys once more, candles were lit within the hall, and fires were stoked with steady patience. The manor exhaled into the gathering twilight, its stones warm from the sun, its windows reflecting the soft hues of the descending sky. The quiet of dusk was not merely absence of noise, but a presence in itself. A settling, a breathing, a gentle reminder that even after tension and vigilance, there is rest. In this lull, the Lord took quiet satisfaction in the continuity of life. Guests had departed, alliances were intact, and yet the subtle lessons of the feast would remain, shaping decisions in ways both visible and unseen. He walked slowly through corridors now softened by candlelight, observing the order preserved within each chamber. The weight of responsibility, though constant, was tempered by the knowledge that life persisted in patterns beyond immediate control. The stars emerged gradually, sharp points of light against a deepening sky. Night carried a hush over the fields and forests, the sound of wind in trees a quiet accompaniment to the occasional rustle of an animal in search of food. The manor's walls, though protective, allowed these distant murmurs to reach within, blending with the echoes of human vigilance and celebration. In the gentle interplay of these forces, the world seemed at once fragile and enduring, each moment suspended yet inevitably moving forward. And so the night passed, slow and measured, carrying with it the memory of both abundance and caution. The feast, though concluded, had left an imprint not only upon the hall but upon the broader world it touched. The village paths, the distant woods, the rhythms of labor and rest that sustained all life. Even in the absence of revelry, its lessons remained, quietly shaping the days and nights that would follow. a reminder that every gathering, however joyful, carries threads that reach far beyond the flicker of candlelight. The morning arrived with a gentle chill, a thin mist drifting across the fields and clinging to the low stone walls that bordered the manor's gardens. Each blade of grass, still heavy with dew, sparkled faintly in the muted light, as if carrying secrets of the night before. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and the faint, lingering aroma of smoked meats from the kitchens. Birds stirred in the hedgerows, their soft calls weaving into the distant hum of human activity, a subtle chorus that marked the beginning of another day. Within the manor, quiet movements resumed with measured precision. Servants tended fires, replenished water basins, and straightened the long tables once used for the feast. Each motion was deliberate, a choreography born of necessity and experience. Bread was sliced and stacked, herbs arranged in neat bundles, and the polished wood of the hall gleamed under the touch of careful hands. The faint creak of floorboards accompanied these tasks, a soft rhythm that underscored the calm continuity of household life. Outside, the village itself mirrored the manor's slow awakening. Children, dressed in homespun tunics, tiptoed through narrow streets, careful not to disturb the livestock or spill the morning's milk. Women carried baskets of freshly gathered eggs or bundles of herbs, their footsteps muted on the worn stones. Men emerged from workshops and stables, faces shaded by the low sun, hands busy with tools and daily tasks. The rhythm of life was deliberate, neither hurried nor idle, each gesture a quiet testament to the persistence of routine. Yet beneath this calm, subtle currents of tension persisted. The feast, though concluded, had left impressions that were not entirely visible. Servants exchanged glances that lingered a fraction too long. The steward noted small irregularities in accounts or inventories, signs that might indicate mischief or oversight. Messages passed along the road carried faint traces of discontent or rivalry, whispers of grievances nurtured in silence. Every gesture, every glance, held potential meaning, and the eyes that watched with patience discerned more than mere appearances. In the hall, the Lord moved with a slow deliberation, observing not only the physical state of his household, but the subtle patterns of behavior that unfolded around him. A young page lingered near the doorway longer than necessary. A cook's hands trembled slightly as she arranged utensils. A guard shifted his weight in a manner that betrayed unease. None of these signs demanded immediate action, yet each was noted and filed, a quiet record of human temperament and circumstance. The Lord's attention was careful but unobtrusive, a silent measure of the balance that maintained order within the household. The gardens beyond the hall offered a different kind of calm. Rows of herbs, vegetables, and flowers were tended with meticulous care, each plant a small testament to patience and observation. Dew clung to petals and leaves, refracting light in soft patterns that shifted as the sun rose higher. The gentle murmur of water from a nearby fountain added to the sense of quiet continuity, a reminder that growth and renewal occurred with time, unhurried by the fleeting concerns of men. In these spaces, the echoes of human rivalry and subtle threats seemed distant, absorbed by the rhythm of natural life that persisted regardless of human intrigue. As the day advanced, visitors approached the manor, some bearing gifts or messages, others arriving with business to conduct. Their presence introduced a gentle complexity to the household, interactions measured and polite, each gesture laden with intention. Courteous bows and deliberate words masked subtler motives. Smiles carried veiled meanings, and eyes that met briefly might conceal observation or calculation. Within the careful structure of these encounters, the influence of the feast lingered, friendships confirmed, alliances tested, and rivalries smoldering beneath polite restraint. In the surrounding fields, labor continued with steady determination. Farmers guided oxen through plowed furrows, their hands calloused and strong, moving in a rhythm dictated by season and soil. Shepherds followed flocks along winding paths, voices low and calm, guiding movement without haste. Even in moments of stillness, the land seemed to pulse with quiet energy. The slow drift of clouds, the gentle sway of grasses, the distant flow of a river carving its path through stone and soil. This constancy provided a grounding backdrop to the subtle and shifting patterns of human behavior within the manor's walls. Within the household, small incidents revealed the delicate interplay of trust and suspicion. A mislaid letter, returned without comment, suggested either oversight or intention. A servant's hesitation in fulfilling a task implied caution or fear. The Lord, moving through these subtleties, observed without intrusion, noting how relationships and loyalties unfolded in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Each observation was recorded in memory, shaping decisions to come, a slow weaving of understanding from the threads of everyday life. Evenings brought a different rhythm, slower and contemplative. Candles flickered in the hall, casting long shadows that danced upon stone walls and polished wood. The air was thick with the scent of simmering stews, herbs, and the faint aroma of wood smoke from the hearth. Servants moved with quiet diligence, tending fires and replenishing lamps, while the Lord walked through the chambers, absorbing the stillness that accompanied the close of day. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting fields and trees in muted shades of gold and amber, a final, gentle illumination before the calm of night. Night carried both rest and reflection. Windows reflected the faint light of stars, and the soft rustle of leaves whispered in the cooling air. The manor's walls, strong and enduring, contained both the weight of human vigilance and the quiet continuity of daily life. Shadows moved slowly across corridors, the echo of footsteps a gentle reminder that even in the absence of overt threat, presence and awareness remained essential. The lessons of the feast, of subtle rivalries and hidden tensions, persisted in these quiet hours, shaping perception and judgment with measured patience. Sleep settled over the household gradually. Pages curled in corners of the hall, guards rested by the doors, and the Lord withdrew to chambers where shadows softened and candlelight waned. Beyond the walls, the village slept in gentle synchrony with the manor, the land itself breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. Even in dreams, traces of the previous night's celebrations and intrigues lingered. A whisper of alliances formed and tested, of loyalty and caution interwoven with moments of abundance and warmth. The world outside remained unchanged in its slow persistence. Stars wheeling across the sky, trees bending slightly with the night wind, animals stirring in quiet, patient movements. Yet within this continuity, the subtle consequences of human gatherings persisted, unseen yet present, shaping days and nights with imperceptible influence. In these quiet currents, the balance of trust and vigilance, alliance and rivalry, endured, a gentle reminder that even the softest moments carried depth and complexity beyond immediate perception. And so the night drew on, slow and measured, carrying with it a sense of equilibrium that bridged the events of the feast and the ongoing rhythm of life. In every corner of the manor, in every distant path and rolling field, the world continued with deliberate calm, guided by patterns both visible and hidden. The quiet presence of order and the gentle persistence of awareness created a tapestry of continuity, a soft illumination in which human vigilance and natural rhythm intertwined seamlessly, leaving the land and its inhabitants suspended in a measured, restful harmony. The manor settled into a quiet rhythm that stretched beyond the last flicker of candlelight. Shadows deepened along the walls, folding into corners where dust had gathered unnoticed during the bustle of day. The subtle creak of floorboards marked movement that was neither hurried nor aimless. Each step was a measured presence, a continuation of the careful watch that had begun long before the feast and lingered in its aftermath. Within the hall, the arrangements of furniture and tapestries seemed unchanged at first glance, yet a closer observation revealed tiny shifts: an unevenly placed chair, the faint tilt of a table, a goblet left slightly askew. These minor variations carried weight, quietly signaling the undercurrents of attention and influence that threaded through the household. Eyes that noticed them recorded meaning in silence, measuring character, patience, and subtle assertion, as the living web of human behavior extended into the spaces themselves. Servants moved with restrained diligence, aware of their own presence and the scrutiny of others. A page paused before a tapestry, fingers brushing its edge before straightening the folds. A cook lingered over a simmering pot, adjusting herbs in a deliberate pattern, aware that the order of small details mattered as much as the grand gestures of the feast. Even the seemingly trivial tasks, the polishing of a candlestick, the folding of a cloth napkin, the stacking of firewood, took on a gentle significance, each a quiet echo of discipline, care, and subtle hierarchy. In the outer chambers, courtiers and attendants carried their thoughts with measured quiet. Glances met and lingered for a fraction longer than etiquette allowed. Hands rested briefly on surfaces as if testing stability, and words, when exchanged, were tempered by the awareness of unseen listeners. Friendships formed and rivalries hardened not in the clamor of debate, but in these nuanced movements and silences, a latticework of influence woven through ordinary gestures. Each participant was conscious of observation, and each observation quietly shaped action, decision, and allegiance. The flickering light from candles and hearths cast gentle shadows that shifted slowly with the evening air, revealing and concealing in equal measure. A shadow might linger where it should not, or stretch along the floor in ways that mirrored attention or intent. The Lord, moving through this subtle interplay, measured these signs with patience, neither intruding nor overlooking. Every gesture, every hesitation or adjustment, became part of a living record, an accumulation of evidence and insight that required only the quiet eye to perceive. Outside, the natural world carried its own rhythms, mirroring the deliberate calm within. Trees swayed gently, leaves whispering in the soft evening wind. The faint ripple of water in a distant stream mirrored the quiet flow of thoughts and observations inside. Even the night creatures moved with measured care. The rustle of a small mammal through underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the soft brush of a wing across still air, all blended into the larger cadence of persistence and continuity. Life continued in its slow, unbroken cycles, attentive yet indifferent to human intrigues. Within this atmosphere, subtle tensions became almost tangible. A footstep that lingered too long, a hand that hesitated before setting down a cup, a breath drawn slightly heavier than necessary. Each acted as an unspoken signal, registering within the mind of the observer. These moments, minute and quiet, shaped relationships with the same weight as open confrontation, a silent measure of loyalty, fear, or ambition. The balance of the household depended on the careful attention paid to these understated currents, as much as on the structure of law or ceremony. The night deepened further, and the household moved into the slower, more reflective part of its rhythm. Candles burned lower, pools of light shrinking into themselves, leaving the walls and floors in muted tones. Servants paused mid-task to straighten a blanket, check a latch, or adjust the placement of a candle holder. Every act of maintenance, however small, contributed to the preservation of order and the quiet reassurance of stability. Even the faintest oversight might be noted, not with immediate reprimand, but with silent registration, a gentle nudge in the intricate pattern of attentions and awareness. Time in these hours seemed to stretch, flowing in a way that was neither hurried nor stagnant. Movements slowed to the pace of breathing, gestures measured by habit and observation rather than necessity. Conversations, when they occurred, were brief and deliberate, words chosen for precision and subtlety, for the implications hidden beneath the surface. The quiet attention of those present created an invisible network of understanding, connecting each individual to the whole while preserving the delicate space for discretion and contemplation. By the depth of night, even the most restless minds settled into a state of measured reflection. Thoughts of the feast, of alliances and rivalries, of moments observed and overlooked, wove into dreams and half-conscious awareness. The household, in its entirety, became a delicate organism, attentive, watchful, yet resting, each part contributing to a sense of enduring order and unspoken understanding. The world beyond the walls, with its distant river, swaying trees, and stars wheeling overhead, mirrored this calm persistence, grounding human activity within the larger, indifferent rhythm of time. In this gentle, sustained quiet, the lessons of vigilance and subtlety endured. Every gesture, every sound, every shadow was recorded in memory and perception, shaping the future with invisible yet undeniable influence. Within the manor, the balance of care, observation, and discretion persisted, a slow, deliberate current that guided action and awareness, and in which the aftermath of the feast lingered, not as loud memory or dramatic disruption, but as a quiet, persistent shaping of life itself. The hall remained in its subdued, measured state, yet beneath the quiet, a subtle current of unease persisted. Shadows seemed to hold weight beyond their mere absence of light, folding across walls and floors in patterns that suggested observation and scrutiny. Those who moved through the space carried with them the faint tension of unspoken awareness, gestures tempered not only by etiquette but by the silent calculus of suspicion and anticipation. Every step, every hand placed upon a surface, every brief pause became a component in a delicate equilibrium, as if the very air remembered the prior gathering and demanded careful attention. The guests who lingered after the feast did so with a quiet deliberation. They navigated corridors and stairwells with measured caution, their presence a soft assertion of status and interest. Each glance, each tilt of the head, contained unvoiced commentary on the actions of others, observations that might later shape alliances or reveal hidden motives. In corners, subtle adjustments to posture or the brief rearrangement of clothing hinted at internal calculations, the mind ever engaged in the soft chess of human interaction. Within the private chambers, servants and attendants carried out their tasks with meticulous care, their motions reflecting a careful balance of duty and discretion. Candles were trimmed with precision, embers stirred to maintain an even warmth, and delicate fabrics smoothed with hands that understood the importance of subtlety. Even the smallest disturbance, a brush of a hand against a tapestry, a footstep too close to a threshold, could carry unintentional significance, registering in the minds of those trained to notice. The house itself seemed attuned to these undercurrents, its walls and floors holding the echoes of careful observation. In the outer corridors, the interplay of light and shadow created a subtle theater. A flickering flame cast patterns across tapestries, momentarily revealing faces or forms before retreating into darkness. In these shifts, the attentive eye might detect hesitation, interest, or quiet calculation in those who passed. Movements were slow, deliberate. A hand resting lightly on a balustrade, a head inclined for a fraction longer than politeness required. Small actions that carried the weight of consideration and sometimes quiet assertion. The Lord, ever aware of these rhythms, observed with a quiet patience. His attention extended across the hall, the chambers, and the corridors, noting slight adjustments in posture, the repetition of certain gestures, and the unintentional disclosure of concern or ambition. Each movement, each small deviation from expected decorum, contributed to a subtle mapping of influence and loyalty. Decisions, though deferred, were informed by this slow accumulation of insight, by the patient study of human behavior under the quiet pressures of proximity and perception. Outside, the evening air deepened, carrying a mixture of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint tang of iron from distant tools or perhaps a forgotten blade. The gardens, pruned and arranged with meticulous care, caught the fading light and shadow, the paths worn smooth in some places, scattered with leaves in others. These small imperfections suggested the presence of watchfulness, or perhaps the subtle assertion of individuality against imposed order. Every detail was noted, even if silently, shaping perception and informing the quiet judgments that governed life within and near the manor. Within this enveloping quiet, the interplay of hidden rivalries became perceptible, not in grand confrontation, but in minute gestures and silences. A guest might pause slightly before taking a seat, weighing proximity to another. A hand resting too firmly upon a tabletop might signal subtle defiance. Conversations, when held in whispered tones, suggested not merely courtesy but careful negotiation, an invisible exchange of intentions and understandings. Loyalty and distrust, ambition and caution, all moved in tandem, unspoken yet evident to those who understood the rhythm of observation and restraint. Even in the most ordinary tasks, signs of human tension persisted. The folding of linens, the alignment of cutlery, the distribution of firewood, all reflected the careful attention paid to order and hierarchy. A servant's hesitation, a chamber's slight disorder, the tilt of a mirror catching light at an unusual angle. These were not trivialities, but part of a subtle communication network, conveying information about vigilance, awareness, and position within the household. The night, dense and still, deepened these patterns. The hall, corridors, and chambers became a stage where the smallest motions carried amplified significance. A shift in gaze, a tilt of the head, a pause mid-step, all were notes in a slow, deliberate symphony of human behavior. In these hours, observation outweighed speech, restraint outweighed impulse. The patterns of loyalty, suspicion, and ambition wove quietly around the participants, unseen yet persistent, shaping the unfolding of events without need for overt declaration. Through the hours that crept into the late night, even the most subtle tensions held a quiet intensity. Those attuned to such currents could perceive the invisible lines of influence and rivalry, the measured assertion of presence and power in gestures too small to command immediate attention. Here, within the calm of the manor's interior, the aftermath of the feast continued not in revelry or conflict, but in the slow, deliberate shaping of perception, a delicate balance maintained by the patience and awareness of those who understood its import. The manor retained its quiet vigilance, yet subtle signs of disruption began to thread through its familiar rhythms. A misplaced cup, a chair slightly out of alignment, a curtain caught by the breeze, small disturbances that might seem inconsequential to an untrained eye, yet for those attuned to the household's delicate equilibrium, they suggested the beginning of shifts. Observation, careful and unhurried, took note of these minor irregularities, and slowly, like ripples across still water, they hinted at tensions that had long remained hidden beneath the calm surface. In the outer corridors, a guest lingered just a fraction too long, pausing to trace a finger along the wooden railing. It was a motion that might have been idle, but it carried subtle weight, an assertion of presence, a quiet claim to space within the layered hierarchy. A servant, passing by, observed this pause without comment, recording it silently as part of the unspoken ledger of behaviors that governed life in the manor. Each gesture, minute yet deliberate, became part of an invisible dialogue that spoke of caution, ambition, and careful testing of boundaries. In the kitchens, the cook moved with deliberate attention, stirring a pot with measured consistency, adjusting the seasoning of a dish with precise care. Yet even here, the undercurrent of tension revealed itself. An unfamiliar smell of herbs left unattended. A tray shifted slightly from its intended place. A knife laid down with a subtle tremor. These minor aberrations were noted by those who moved through the spaces after, their minds weighing the significance of every overlooked detail, each one a potential signal, deliberate or unintentional, of alliance or dissent. The hall itself seemed to respond to these quiet disturbances. Candles burned unevenly, their light flickering against the walls and tapestries, revealing corners that had seemed still only moments before. Shadows stretched and contracted, painting temporary impressions of movement and presence. Each shift of light suggested possibilities and cautions. Each soft creak of a floorboard carried significance beyond the sound itself. The manor, in its attentive quiet, absorbed every motion, every nuance, folding them into a broader pattern of understanding that only patient observation could fully decipher. Amid these subtle disturbances, the lord of the house maintained his measured oversight. He moved through the spaces with calm awareness, noting the faintest deviations from routine, the smallest gestures that might betray hidden intention. Every glance, every touch, every adjustment of a sleeve or a piece of furniture was recorded in the mind, added to a mental map of loyalty, caution, and the quiet assertion of influence. Decisions remained deferred, yet their foundation was being laid steadily, with the slow accumulation of subtle evidence. In private chambers, courtiers and attendants began to reveal, through their ordinary actions, traces of emerging tension. A page lingered too long over a letter, tracing its edges with an unsteady hand. A chambermaid adjusted the placement of a tapestry repeatedly, as if testing the attention of those who might notice. Even the distribution of candles, the careful placement of firewood, and the alignment of utensils on a table became vehicles for communication, a silent negotiation of presence, caution, and quiet assertion. Outside, the gardens mirrored this cautious awareness. Paths worn smooth in some places contrasted with scattered leaves in others, small imbalances suggesting observation and subtle intervention. The evening breeze shifted the branches of trees in deliberate patterns, rustling leaves in ways that hinted at movement, yet left the observer uncertain of its source. In the distant stream, the faint ripple of water marked time and continuity, reflecting the slow, persistent flow of the household's unspoken interactions. Through these hours, the interplay of observation and subtle disruption deepened. Guests and attendants alike navigated the spaces with heightened attention, aware of the slightest irregularities, each one interpreted within the complex web of relationships, ambitions, and silent agreements. The quiet persistence of watchfulness shaped action and restraint, ensuring that even the smallest gesture carried significance, and that the unfolding of influence and suspicion continued without overt declaration. By the depth of night, the manor was a tapestry of quiet tensions, its calm surface concealing a careful interplay of attention, caution, and subtle assertion. Each gesture, each pause, each adjustment contributed to a living record of human behavior, quietly molding perception and expectation. The aftermath of the feast lingered not in visible conflict, but in the persistent shaping of the household's internal rhythms, a gentle yet insistent current guiding the balance of power and the careful unfolding of intrigue. In this sustained quiet, the slow emergence of consequence became perceptible, though only to those patient enough to notice. Small disturbances hinted at larger possibilities, and subtle shifts in behavior whispered of intentions yet unspoken. The household, attentive and deliberate, absorbed these signs into its ongoing rhythm, a living organism in which the aftermath of revelry continued to influence thought, action, and the intricate patterns of human presence. The night pressed gently upon the manor, extending its quiet dominion over halls, chambers, and gardens alike. The air was heavy with the lingering warmth of day and the faint chill that heralded early autumn. Each room held its own scent of wood smoke, wax, and the subtle traces of those who had passed through earlier, faint perfumes, dust disturbed, fabrics pressed by attentive hands. In the hallways, the echo of footsteps, though infrequent, carried a distinct weight, each sound measured and deliberate, resonating against the stone walls with a faint sense of consequence. A solitary torch, still burning near the entrance of a side corridor, cast a trembling light upon the tapestry-lined walls. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the faint rustle of a curtain suggested movement, yet no sound beyond this could be heard. Within this hushed environment, subtle observations became significant. A tilt of the head, the brief pause of a hand on a railing, the slight shifting of a candle to catch light differently on the polished surface of a table. These small gestures were recorded in silence, each one feeding the ongoing assessment of loyalty, caution, and intent. In the private chambers of the Lord, the air was dense with unspoken deliberation. Though sleep approached the household in waves, the Lord remained awake, seated beside a low table cluttered with parchment and ink. The flickering candlelight painted the lines of his face in soft, wavering shadows, tracing the curve of a brow, the pressed tension around eyes accustomed to observation. Every report received, every word overheard or subtly extracted from the pages of correspondence, was absorbed, weighed, and stored for future reference. The mind worked in a deliberate rhythm, cataloging small irregularities, subtle gestures, and unanticipated movements as threads in a complex tapestry of understanding. Outside his chambers, the corridors retained their own quiet significance. Courtiers, servants, and occasional guards moved with measured discretion, attuned to the rhythms of the household. A page carrying a folded letter navigated the hall with careful attention to footsteps, glances, and the faint creaking of boards. The letter itself contained nothing overtly alarming, yet the slightest hesitation in delivering it, or the deliberate placement of it in a particular hand, carried layered meaning. Here, even the ordinary act of message delivery was transformed into a subtle negotiation, a dance of timing and attention that could reveal ambition or signal deference. In the chambers adjacent to the kitchens, the aroma of spiced wine and residual warmth of evening meals lingered. Attendants moved softly, their hands arranging trays, polishing utensils, or adjusting the alignment of bowls. Each gesture was performed with mindful precision, and even the smallest slip, a cup placed slightly askew, a spoon resting with its handle pointing in an unusual direction, could be interpreted as carelessness or intentional suggestion. The household had long learned to read these signs, for every motion, however mundane, might carry hidden import. Within the hall itself, where the feasting had left its echoes, the air had cooled, yet its quiet intensity remained. Chairs were tucked in, banners hung evenly, and the floor bore the faint traces of scuffed shoes and the delicate imprints of skirts and tunics. Here, the residual energy of prior gatherings lingered, interwoven with the persistent undertone of observation. Those who remained awake, whether by duty or inclination, noted each minor adjustment of position, each subtle rearrangement of objects, and the silent interactions that occurred within the periphery of sight. The gardens, too, were not untouched by this sense of deliberate attentiveness. Moonlight traced the edges of neatly trimmed hedges, reflecting softly on damp leaves. The paths, worn from frequent travel, glistened faintly with dew, suggesting the passage of unseen feet. Even the sound of wind brushing against the branches seemed measured, revealing nuances that an attentive observer could interpret: footsteps that had passed a moment before, slight shifts in earth or foliage, or the subtle bending of a branch to indicate someone's passage. In this manner, the natural world of the manor participated in the quiet web of awareness, responding to, and sometimes amplifying, the rhythms of human interaction. In a narrow corridor connecting the main hall to the private chambers, a guest moved cautiously, trailing a finger along the carved wood of the wall. Each step was deliberate, each breath controlled, as if the very act of presence demanded careful consideration. Behind the guest, shadows moved differently, stretching along the stone, merging and separating in the flickering torchlight. The interplay of light and form created an ever-shifting panorama of perception, allowing subtle shifts in posture, hesitation, or gaze to be magnified in significance. Observation here was both art and necessity, an unspoken language that all within the household understood. Meanwhile, the Lord, still seated among his papers, allowed his mind to trace the invisible connections that had begun to surface in the hours following the feast. Names, gestures, and encounters were traced and retraced, patterns emerging as the subtle interactions of guests and attendants wove themselves into a discernible structure. The quiet calculation of alliances and rivalries unfolded gradually, each observed nuance adding weight to potential decisions. What might seem trivial to an outsider, a hand extended slightly too far, a foot angled just so, could signify the undercurrent of ambition or restraint, of loyalty or concealed dissent. Through the night, the manor's quiet vigilance persisted. In the kitchens, pots cooled on the hearth, while the last attendants moved among them, their motions carefully measured to avoid drawing attention. A spoon shifted slightly against the lip of a bowl. A cloth was folded and unfolded once before being placed aside, each minor motion recorded unconsciously by the observant eye. Even these gestures, ordinary to the casual observer, became part of the broader tapestry of perception, contributing to the ongoing assessment of intent and presence. The upper galleries, where tapestries hung and the echoes of voices lingered faintly, were suffused with shadows that seemed to move independently of those who passed beneath them. A figure paused before one such tapestry, tracing its edge lightly with a gloved hand, and then withdrew. In the absence of conversation, these movements spoke volumes. Subtle claims of space, quiet examination, or the gauging of an unseen audience. Observation remained constant, patience the principal companion of those attuned to the manor's delicate social structure. The faintest noises carried through the night with unusual clarity, each creak and sigh of the building becoming part of the manifold observations of those who moved within its walls. In the northern wing, a chambermaid adjusted the placement of a basin, aligning it so that the reflection of the candlelight fell evenly upon the polished surface. Though the act seemed trivial, it was noted by a nearby attendant, who allowed the eyes to linger momentarily on the careful hand and its intent. In these small adjustments, the minutiae of vigilance revealed themselves, each motion a whisper of order or an assertion of control, the subtle articulation of responsibility and attention. Elsewhere, in a smaller antechamber, a young scribe bent over parchment, the tip of a quill tracing lines of ink with deliberate precision. The scratching sound seemed loud in the otherwise quiet space, a minor punctuating rhythm against the hush of the manor. He paused frequently, lifting the quill to observe the alignment of words and the spacing between lines, each gesture revealing not impatience but careful thought, the same patience that governed the household itself. The presence of observation, even unseen, shaped the scribe's movements, binding ordinary action to the quiet protocol of attention. In the main hall, the empty tables bore faint traces of feasting. Crumbs, a droplet of wine, a napkin left slightly askew. The air held the mingled warmth of spiced dishes, wax, and lingering human presence, scented faintly with perfume and smoke. Footsteps, soft and careful, moved across the floorboards, navigating around these residual traces with deliberate mindfulness. Each traveler within these spaces, whether guest or attendant, negotiated the physical environment as part of a wider social landscape, understanding that even the smallest disturbance could carry significance. In a chamber overlooking the gardens, a guest stood in near darkness, tracing the edges of a map with a finger. The candle's light, placed just beyond reach, cast a faint glow, illuminating enough to perceive the lines but not to betray them fully. The gesture was unremarkable in its physicality, yet it revealed a deliberate calculation, the quiet weighing of paths, the mapping of relationships and alliances in the mind's eye. Observation, as it continued through these hours, was as much mental as physical, weaving subtle impressions into a comprehensive understanding of circumstance and potential. The gardens themselves, under the low sweep of moonlight, appeared placid, yet each leaf and branch seemed attuned to possibility. Dew clung to blades of grass, reflecting the light in tiny pinpricks that shifted with the wind. The faint rustle of a fox moving along the periphery or the distant call of an owl became parts of a larger auditory tapestry, where each sound was interpreted and catalogued, providing context for understanding movement and presence beyond the visible. The natural world, quiet and persistent, augmented the subtle strategies of vigilance that defined the household at this hour. In a narrow hallway leading toward the Lord's chambers, a footstep echoed more distinctly than intended, drawing a subtle glance from a passing guard. The guard, though still and silent, recorded the deviation, noting the rhythm and cadence of the intruding step. Here, patience and quiet attention were again the measures of significance, the discernment of patterns as vital as any overt act. The presence of another human, even in absence of dialogue, carried meaning, and the careful calibration of observation allowed the household to maintain a persistent equilibrium of awareness. Elsewhere, in the upper galleries, a tapestry fluttered slightly as the night air shifted. The movement drew the attention of a chamberlain who happened to pass, prompting a measured inspection. The slight irregularity revealed nothing overtly consequential, yet in the context of the evening's lingering tensions, even such a trivial motion could prompt reflection. Who had disturbed the space, and for what reason? The mind traced possible sequences, imagining the interplay of intent and circumstance, and the chamberlain's measured response reinforced the constant attentiveness that permeated the manor. A door, left slightly ajar, offered a glimpse into a small sitting room where a fire burned low, casting gentle shadows across the polished floor. The faint warmth, mingled with the lingering scent of smoke and wax, created a quiet sense of continuity and comfort, yet also served as a stage for potential observation. Any movement within this space could be noticed or unnoticed, depending upon subtle alignment, the positioning of light, and the perception of those who might pass by. Here, ordinary domesticity and the persistent calculus of vigilance intertwined seamlessly, each element influencing the other. In the servants' quarters, quiet labor continued with a patience that mirrored the attentiveness of the upper chambers. Linen folded precisely, basins filled with fresh water, and the placement of utensils executed with a care that suggested awareness of scrutiny beyond immediate perception. Even as fatigue pressed against the attendants' bodies, the rigor of habit, the discipline of observation, maintained continuity and order. The household, from top to bottom, functioned as a living network of awareness, each component reinforcing the subtle balance that the night's silence encouraged. The Lord, seated once more among papers and ledgers, allowed the mind to wander through the complexities of human disposition and alliance. He traced the interactions of the evening, revisiting observed gestures, noting repetitions and divergences. Names, faces, and movements were connected with imagined lines, forming constellations of influence and cautious negotiation. The awareness of potential threat, subtle or overt, did not dominate the mind but remained present, like the faint pulse beneath the quiet rhythm of the manor. In this sustained contemplation, strategy and understanding were cultivated without haste, the slow accumulation of insight forming the groundwork for decisions yet to come. Through the corridors, the soft hum of wind against stone echoed faintly, reinforcing the stillness that wrapped the manor. Each footfall, each whispered rustle of fabric, became part of the sensory network, contributing to the continuous mapping of human presence. Even the smallest irregularities, the shift of a chair, the placement of a book, the angle of a candlestick, assumed significance when viewed through the lens of sustained vigilance. The night's passage was measured not in grand events but in these delicate movements, the quiet calculus that defined life within these walls. In a side chamber, a guest adjusted the drapery, momentarily revealing the pale glow of moonlight across the floor. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet within the patterns of observation it resonated. Those who were attentive could note the placement, the timing, the interaction with light and shadow, and read it as a fragment of intent. Observation remained patient and deliberate, emphasizing a slow, steady accumulation of meaning over any sudden revelation. By the depth of night, the household existed in a delicate equilibrium. The interplay of observation, minor disruption, and subtle assertion had established a network of understanding, invisible yet pervasive. Every gesture, every footstep, every alteration of the physical environment contributed to a living record of presence and intent. Even the natural world, with its moonlight, dew, and gentle wind, became a participant in this quiet orchestration, reinforcing the persistence of attention and the careful unfolding of influence. The servants' routine persisted with gentle persistence, each act almost ritualistic, forming patterns that both concealed and revealed human presence. A tray, once laden with cups and platters, was carried with a quiet rhythm down a narrow corridor. The subtle clink of metal against porcelain, though barely audible, registered with those attuned to the night's quiet symphony. Each motion was deliberate, measured, and mindful of both audience and space, illustrating how even the simplest gestures could carry layered meaning. In a dimly lit corner of the hall, a young steward meticulously inspected the placement of chairs and benches. His hands moved over the carved edges, brushing against polished surfaces to detect imperfections or shifts. The act, ostensibly minor, reflected an awareness of hierarchy and propriety. Each object had its place, and deviation could signify oversight, disorder, or subtle rebellion. The night, for those with the patience to perceive, was a canvas on which social order was reaffirmed, a slow dance of alignment and awareness. Outside, the courtyard carried a different rhythm. The moonlight glinted off cobblestones, each stone slick with dew or rain from earlier hours. The occasional ripple of movement, the furtive shadow of a cat, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, all contributed to an intricate sensory landscape. Here, the night's vigilance extended beyond walls, merging natural observation with human surveillance. Paths once familiar were reconsidered under the interplay of light and shadow, revealing hidden corners and subtle vulnerabilities. Within the manor's walls, the subtle choreography continued. A chambermaid straightened a tapestry that had begun to sag, while in another wing, a guard traced the line of a corridor with deliberate steps, his gaze flicking to doors and recesses where movement might be concealed. Each participant in this nocturnal performance acted in concert with an unspoken understanding. Attention was both a shield and a tool, guarding against disruption while shaping perception. The quiet patience of the night amplified small gestures, transforming them into indicators of vigilance, loyalty, and caution. In a small study adjoining the Lord's private chambers, a scholar worked by candlelight, tracing marginal notes on parchment with delicate strokes. The texture of ink on paper, the faint scent of dried herbs nearby, and the occasional sigh of the wind through the shutters all became part of a layered sensory experience. Each recorded observation, no matter how minor, fed into a broader comprehension of circumstance. Knowledge, meticulously accumulated, became a subtle form of power, not in loud proclamation but in quiet certainty. From an upper balcony, the soft creak of the floorboards marked the passage of a figure draped in shadow. He paused, sensing movement beneath him, the faint rustle of fabric in distant chambers. Though he remained unseen, he absorbed every auditory clue. A chair shifted, a door latch clicked, the subtle adjustment of a curtain. The night amplified these small disturbances, allowing him to construct a mental map of human activity and intent. Awareness became a form of dominion, quietly asserting itself over spaces otherwise thought inert. In another corridor, a faint light flickered across the walls, emanating from a lantern carried by a cautious servant. The flame's movement cast shifting shadows, revealing angles and textures previously unnoticed. The servant, though focused on the simple task of illumination, engaged in a form of silent negotiation with the space, balancing the need for visibility with the awareness that each flicker of light might betray presence or intent. Here, patience and deliberate movement were inseparable from perception, every small decision contributing to the overall understanding of the environment. The hallways, empty of conversation, carried whispers of history in their worn surfaces. Stone steps, polished by countless passages, retained a faint memory of footsteps, each a record of human routine. The walls themselves, adorned with tapestries and carved panels, reflected light in muted, shifting patterns. These elements, static yet responsive to human interaction, formed an enduring backdrop against which the night's subtle drama unfolded. Every step, gesture, and shift was observed against this quiet stage, transforming ordinary corridors into vessels of meaning. In the kitchens, the fire's embers glowed faintly, their warmth reaching only partway into the large, stone-floored room. The cooks, though nearly finished with the night's tasks, continued with methodical movements, washing knives, stacking pots, scrubbing surfaces. The rhythm of these actions, though largely practical, was imbued with a latent sense of discipline, reflecting the structure imposed upon every aspect of the household. Even in the absence of feasting, the ritual of care persisted, a quiet assertion of order amidst potential disorder. A narrow stairwell offered the passage to the upper servant quarters, where the smallest of disturbances, an errant step, a misaligned bucket, was enough to draw attention. Yet each such observation was absorbed and accounted for without urgency, allowing for a slow, cumulative understanding of movement and behavior. Patience governed perception, and perception in turn reinforced the household's sense of continuity and security. Small anomalies, when considered over time, revealed patterns that might otherwise remain concealed, shaping both expectation and response. Meanwhile, in the private chambers of the Lord, the accumulation of observation manifested as deliberate reflection. He considered the interactions of the evening, not with anxiety, but with quiet intent, tracing the trajectories of influence and the subtle currents of rivalry. The mind's eye moved across the hallways, gardens, and chambers, revisiting gestures and placements, cataloging signs of loyalty, hesitation, and opportunism. Here, understanding was constructed not from grand gestures but from minute observations, the slow layering of insight upon insight. Through an adjacent window, the gardens remained bathed in silver light. Dew-coated petals glimmered faintly, the shadows of branches shifting with the night wind. The quiet majesty of the scene reminded those who watched that the natural world existed independently, yet in dialogue with human activity. The interplay of flora, light, and movement became a subtle language, where the careful observer could discern much about timing, presence, and even intent. Nature's rhythm intertwined with human vigilance, forming a continuous tapestry of interaction and awareness. In the deeper recesses of the manor, the quiet continued uninterrupted. Servants moved with measured care, correcting small irregularities before they became notable. Guards adjusted the positions of torches and lanterns, ensuring consistent illumination. Scholars and stewards reviewed records and plans, while the Lord continued his contemplation, drawing connections between observed gestures and anticipated outcomes. In these hours, the ordinary minutiae of life were infused with significance, each act serving as both expression and observation, a means of maintaining equilibrium and asserting subtle influence. At last, in the hour before the earliest light of dawn, the manor seemed to exhale. Movements slowed, gestures became fewer, and the attentiveness of the night, though not diminished, was marked by a steady rhythm rather than the initial alertness. The courtyards lay in shadowed quiet, the halls reflected dim, flickering candlelight, and even the natural world appeared to hold its breath. In this prolonged stillness, the accumulation of observation and care produced a sense of cohesion, a latent assurance that the household had maintained its order through the silent passage of night. The final moments of darkness were not empty. They were dense with reflection, awareness, and continuity. Every gesture, every sound, and every shadow had contributed to the slow unfolding of understanding. The night, in its deliberate and measured unfolding, had allowed human vigilance, subtle strategy, and patient observation to assert themselves without the need for haste or spectacle. And as the first faint light of morning began to touch the outer walls, the manor was poised on the threshold of day, its order intact, its subtle networks of awareness woven more firmly than before. As the first light of dawn crept over the distant hills, the manor's surfaces shifted in quiet response. Stone walls, once cloaked in shadow, absorbed the soft illumination, revealing textures previously softened by darkness. Each carved arch and polished surface became more defined, yet the transformation was gradual, measured, and imperceptible to all but the most attentive eye. The interplay of light and shadow lent a mutable character to the space, as if the house itself breathed and responded to the day's awakening. In the kitchens, the last embers of the nocturnal fire smoldered gently. The cook, now stretching and loosening stiff muscles, surveyed the polished counters and organized utensils. Every pot, spoon, and vessel gleamed faintly, reflecting the soft glow from narrow windows. The effort invested in the quiet hours had not been for immediate spectacle, but for the establishment of readiness and continuity. There was a rhythm to this preparation that transcended mere practicality, a rhythm rooted in anticipation and the care of human habit. Corridors and stairways, once echoing with the muted clatter of movement, now settled into a delicate stillness. The shadows receded toward corners, yet did not vanish entirely. Their lingering presence preserved memory and continuity, traces of nocturnal vigilance. A tapestry, adjusted and straightened by a careful hand, retained subtle folds that hinted at the passage of time and attention. Such details, minor in isolation, accumulated into a pervasive sense of order, revealing the household's quiet mastery over the night's potential disorder. From a high window, the steward observed the grounds below. Dew-laden paths glimmered under the early sun, reflecting shapes of figures previously unseen in darkness. The slow movement of servants, preparing gardens and courtyards, traced a silent choreography that echoed the night's rituals. Each step and gesture spoke of knowledge internalized and duties faithfully performed, an unspoken testament to the care with which human activity could structure even a sprawling manor. Within the Lord's private chambers, he moved with deliberate slowness, taking measure of the night's accumulated observations. He noted patterns, recalling gestures and silences alike. Even in the absence of immediate threat or spectacle, awareness had sharpened and attention had been refined. The Lord's understanding of loyalty, subtle tension, and latent rivalry was woven into these reflections, each thread contributing to a quiet but persistent clarity of perception. The servants, now beginning to awaken fully, engaged in their morning routines with gentle consistency. The sweeping of floors, the careful arrangement of linens, and the preparation of fires and utensils all reinforced the manor's pervasive sense of order. Tasks once performed under low candlelight now unfolded beneath growing clarity. Yet the meticulous attention and care remained unchanged. In every measured action, there persisted the echo of the night's vigilance, a continuity that defined the household's rhythm and reinforced its stability. The hallways, bathed in early light, revealed layers of history embedded in stone and wood. Each notch, scratch, and polish spoke of long-term use, a silent chronicle of generations. The tactile presence of human touch, accumulated over years, reinforced the sense of space as both protector and participant in daily life. Shadows moved in gentle accord with the sun's angle, painting transient designs across the walls and floors, lending the environment a subtle dynamism even in moments of apparent stillness. Outside, the gardens responded to the morning's arrival with a delicate stir. Leaves quivered in soft breezes, petals tilted toward the growing warmth, and dew evaporated with a faint hiss. Birds began their cautious songs, punctuating the serenity with gentle movement and sound. The natural world, though independent, seemed to converse quietly with human rhythm, as though the passage of night and day had woven a subtle agreement between attention and environment. A small group of guards convened near the outer gates, checking the alignment of barriers, peering into shadows, and noting early movement among the distant fields. Their motions were careful yet unobtrusive, maintaining continuity with the vigilance of the night. Observation and readiness were embedded not as performance but as a habitual condition, a seamless extension of both duty and perception. Even in quietude, their presence reinforced the sense of order and attentive care that permeated the manor. Within the library, the scholar continued to examine marginal notes from the previous evening. The play of light across the parchment revealed nuances in ink and texture that had gone unnoticed in candlelight. The accumulation of recorded knowledge, now set against the clarity of day, offered insight into subtle patterns of behavior, shifts in protocol, and the faint echoes of rivalries long held in check. The quiet act of study, devoid of urgency or spectacle, became a testament to the enduring potency of observation and reflection. Throughout the manor, each participant in the household's unfolding rhythm remained attentive to the smallest shifts. Servants, guards, and scholars alike moved in a slow, deliberate harmony that emphasized patience over haste, presence over action. Every adjustment, gesture, and glance contributed to an intricate lattice of continuity, a framework that preserved not only physical order but also social stability. Within this lattice, subtle tension and latent vigilance coexisted, ensuring that the manifold interests of the household remained balanced even in apparent tranquility. The corridors, now suffused with diffused morning light, retained their quiet resonance. Stone surfaces, worn smooth by countless footsteps, reflected a continuity that neither hurried time nor overlooked human care. Tapestries displayed their muted hues in the shifting sunlight, shadows tracing their folds and revealing textures too subtle to perceive by night. These details, gently amplified by the dawn, reminded all observers of the layered interplay between human activity and enduring structure. In the great hall, benches and tables reflected the careful adjustments of the previous hours. Though the feast had long since ended, the residue of order and attentiveness remained, a subtle testimony to human diligence. The hall, like the household at large, carried a sense of readiness that transcended immediate necessity, embodying the cumulative effect of patient observation, careful labor, and deliberate maintenance of both space and decorum. The Lord, now fully immersed in the quiet rhythms of morning, contemplated the web of relationships and influence that had quietly unfolded overnight. Gestures observed, minor adjustments noted, and patterns discerned formed the basis for measured decisions to come. There was no urgency in reflection, no dramatic flourish in insight, only the steady accrual of understanding shaped by attentive perception. In this, power revealed itself not in outward assertion, but in the quiet mastery of knowledge, awareness, and careful anticipation. As the sun rose higher, bathing the outer walls in golden warmth, the manor settled into a gentle, sustained rhythm. The night's vigilance, though concluded, left a persistent imprint on human behavior and environment alike. Order, awareness, and attentive care permeated every chamber and corridor, blending seamlessly with the early light. The convergence of night's patience and day's clarity forged a space of subtle stability, one in which both human and natural rhythm harmonized in deliberate accord. By mid-morning, the household exuded a calm energy, measured, attentive, and continuous. Tasks proceeded with deliberate care, observation continued with quiet diligence, and even minor disturbances were absorbed with composure. The intricate weave of vigilance, knowledge, and routine established the manor as a living organism of quiet order, sustaining human activity through both night and day, anticipation and reflection. In this extended calm, there was a pervasive sense of completeness. The night's careful monitoring and the day's soft illumination had created a continuum in which subtle awareness and human diligence coalesced. Within the walls of the manor, time unfolded not in abrupt episodes, but in a continuous, patient flow marked by the measured cadence of observation, the gentle affirmation of structure, and the enduring presence of thoughtful attention. And thus, as the morning advanced into the full clarity of day, the manor existed in its quiet equilibrium, a place where patience, observation, and care ensured that both subtle intrigue and latent danger were balanced by steadfast attention. In this gentle, unhurried harmony, the household persisted, an enduring testament to the power of deliberate rhythm, quiet vigilance, and the patient maintenance of order. The afternoon light moved slowly across the halls, tracing long, gentle patterns over the stone floors and wooden beams. The warmth, soft and unhurried, seemed to breathe life into the household, accentuating the quiet rhythm that had been established through the night and morning. Servants moved with gentle deliberation, attending to minor tasks with a consistency born of routine and care, their motions echoing the meticulous order that had persisted through every hour. In the outer chambers, windows framed a world of subtle motion. Leaves shimmered in slow breezes, petals swayed with measured grace, and birds flitted from branch to branch, their movements delicate and unassertive. The interplay of light and shadow cast intricate patterns across the walls, revealing textures and nuances that spoke of enduring attention. Within this gentle world, time seemed to stretch, allowing each detail, stone, wood, fabric, and foliage, to exist fully, observed in patient acknowledgement. The Lord, seated at a carved table near a northern window, contemplated the subtle currents of loyalty and rivalry that had unfolded over the past days. The observations gathered during the night and morning merged into a quiet understanding of the household's inner life. Gestures and silences, previously imperceptible, now revealed patterns of influence, subtle alliances, and unspoken tensions. There was no urgency in this contemplation, only a measured awareness that permitted insight to emerge without disturbance. Meanwhile, the kitchens exhaled the faint warmth of ongoing preparation. Fires smoldered beneath large cauldrons, their heat tempered by careful tending, and the aroma of herbs and roasted grains filled the air in gentle waves. Every action was deliberate: the placement of a pot, the wiping of a counter, the polishing of utensils. Though the grandeur of a feast was no longer imminent, the household maintained its ritual of care and readiness, reinforcing a sense of stability and continuity that extended beyond any single event. In the halls and corridors, dust motes drifted lazily in slanting shafts of light, revealing the intricacies of carved panels and worn stone. Each movement of air stirred memories of countless footsteps and quiet labors, a record embedded in texture and shadow. Servants' gestures mirrored the order of previous hours, while the soft creak of floorboards spoke of presence without intrusion. It was a living balance in which every element, human and material, participated in the subtle maintenance of equilibrium. From the high windows, the steward surveyed the gardens once more. The dew had receded, leaving a gentle shimmer on blades of grass, while flowers displayed their colors with quiet assurance. Paths wound through shaded groves, and hedges, clipped and tended, stood as testimony to patient care. The landscape reflected the household within, measured, deliberate, and mindful of both beauty and function. Every observation, every small adjustment, reinforced the harmony that had been carefully cultivated. The library, bathed in afternoon light, revealed the scholar's meticulous notes. Pages turned slowly, the texture of parchment and the subtle variances in ink informing interpretations that were neither rushed nor imposed. Patterns of behavior and subtle tensions across the household emerged through attentive study, yet no immediate action was required. Insight, like the light itself, unfolded gradually, illuminating connections without harshness or disruption. The guards, now less vigilant in the intensity of night, maintained their presence with gentle assurance. Their watchfulness was quiet, measured, almost invisible, yet it lent the household a pervasive sense of safety. Every glance, step, and shift was part of a continuum extending from nocturnal diligence through the clarity of morning to the calm assurance of afternoon. Within this framework, vigilance existed not as alarm, but as enduring structure, a quiet support for the rhythms of life within the manor. As the hours passed, a subtle transition unfolded. Attention, once focused on immediate readiness and observation, began to broaden into reflection and recollection. Gestures previously noted, glances observed, and minor incidents of potential discord became threads in a larger tapestry. The household's rhythm, once concentrated in discrete tasks and careful scrutiny, now allowed space for awareness of continuity itself, for the gentle understanding of life's unhurried progression. In the great hall, the echoes of previous gatherings lingered in the polished wood and stone. Chairs, benches, and tables bore traces of movement and touch, their alignment reflecting careful adjustment rather than abrupt correction. The air, perfumed faintly by dried herbs and lingering smoke from smoldering fires, carried an impression of persistence and care. Here, even the absence of spectacle spoke more profoundly than any display of energy, revealing the understated mastery of time, attention, and human diligence. The Lord rose slowly, walking through corridors and chambers in a measured survey of the manor. His footsteps were soft, deliberate, and mindful of the subtleties of both space and human presence. He paused briefly to observe a servant arranging linens, another sweeping the floor, a scholar adjusting a page in the library. Each movement, small and often overlooked, contributed to a cohesive rhythm, sustaining the household in a state of quiet balance and attentive order. With the gradual passage of afternoon toward evening, the light softened once again, shifting from the bright clarity of midday to the gentle warmth of late day. Shadows lengthened and mingled, creating textures that spoke of both continuity and transformation. In this transition, the household moved seamlessly, without urgency or tension, maintaining its intricate structure of observation, care, and measured diligence. The gardens, reflecting the gentle diminution of light, glowed with a softer palette. Flowers tilted in the waning sun, leaves shifted subtly with the evening breeze, and paths were traced with long, delicate shadows. In this quiet spectacle, nature's rhythm mirrored the human rhythm within the manor, reinforcing the sense of equilibrium, patience, and continuity that had been nurtured throughout the day. Subtle reflections of the past mingled with the present, as the household acknowledged both the potential dangers once lurking in darkness and the careful management that had preserved stability. Every gesture, every small adjustment, every moment of attention contributed to a larger understanding that the intricate web of observation, diligence, and human care had succeeded in maintaining order without spectacle or abrupt intervention. As evening approached, fires were stoked lightly in fireplaces, their warmth gentle yet sufficient. The aroma of roasted grains, herbs, and simmering stews permeated the hallways, a quiet continuation of the domestic rhythm established in earlier hours. Servants moved with calm assurance, completing tasks with measured diligence, their actions a subtle affirmation of the household's continuity and stability. The Lord, now observing the final patterns of light and shadow across his manor, allowed a deep exhalation of contemplation. The quiet achievements of the day, the endurance of vigilance through night and morning, the subtle balance of relationships and routines, all converged in a gentle affirmation of order and harmony. There was no need for abrupt resolution, no necessity for dramatic assertion. Instead, the gentle culmination of careful attention sufficed, as the house and its occupants settled into the natural rhythm of evening. Outside, the sky deepened, clouds tinged with soft hues of pink and gold, reflecting the slow retreat of the sun. The world beyond the walls moved with its own measured pace, echoing the careful cadence within. The connection between human diligence and natural rhythm became apparent, a silent reassurance that life, though complex and occasionally fraught with tension, possessed an inherent continuity capable of withstanding subtle challenges. The hallways, now partially illuminated by lamplight, preserved the texture of human presence alongside the evidence of time's passage. Floors, walls, and tapestries retained the memory of footsteps, glances, and gestures, quietly affirming the household's enduring attention. Every shadow, every flicker of light, carried a gentle reminder of care and patience, of a vigilance exercised not in alarm but in quiet, enduring harmony. By the late evening, the manor had fully settled into its nightly rhythm, a serene balance between vigilance and rest, between careful observation and measured reflection. The household existed as a coherent organism, its myriad components, stone, wood, fire, fabric, human presence, interwoven in a tapestry of attention, patience, and subtle awareness. The scholar, the steward, the guards, the servants, and the Lord alike contributed to this delicate equilibrium. Each action harmonized with the larger pattern of life within the manor. Even the smallest gestures resonated across the household, reinforcing stability and the persistent care that had defined both day and night. In this continuum, danger and intrigue were neither denied nor dramatized. They existed only as elements to be met with attention, subtlety, and enduring vigilance. As darkness deepened, the final movements of the day merged with the quiet anticipation of night. The manor, attentive and composed, absorbed these transitions with the patience cultivated through countless hours of observation, care, and deliberate action. Every chamber, every corridor, every corner of light and shadow spoke of continuity, of awareness preserved through measured attention, and of the gentle mastery of human activity across time. And so, The household settled fully, not with sudden cessation, but with the enduring calm of completeness. The interplay of light and shadow, the memory of gestures and movements, the steady rhythm of vigilance and care, all converged in a gentle affirmation of harmony. Life within the manor continued with unhurried grace, each detail preserved, each observation quietly noted, each moment absorbed into the larger fabric of existence. In the final quiet, as night enveloped stone, wood, and fabric alike, the manor remained a testament to patience, attentiveness, and the subtle orchestration of human presence. Every flicker of light, every rustle of fabric, every breath drawn within the walls became part of an ongoing rhythm. A rhythm neither urgent nor interrupted, but complete in its measured, deliberate unfolding. And in this enduring, gentle balance, the tale of feasts and intrigue, vigilance and care, subtle rivalry and patient observation found its quiet resolution. There were no dramatic revelations at the end, no abrupt conclusions, only the soft, continuous affirmation of order and equilibrium. The household, having navigated shadow and subtle danger alike, rested in the serene certainty of its own sustained rhythm. The evening deepened into night, the firelight dimmed to embers, and the manor, secure in its balance, exhaled in unhurried contentment. Outside, the world slept, and within, every motion, every breath, every whisper of shadow or light spoke of enduring care and quiet harmony. The story, having unfolded across hours, gestures, and subtle events, found its natural conclusion in the seamless rhythm of life, a life observed, maintained, and quietly celebrated. And thus, the house and its inhabitants, guardians of subtle order and patient attention, rested at last.